Maddox slammed the rifle
You're
into her
finished,
chest.
little girl.
"You think you know my
Yeah, you
range?"
are.
His
Get
laugh
off
cut
me.
across 40 pairs of watching eyes.
Ha!
"Then
Now
shoot
who's
right now
finished?
that target." End of the line. Avery Bennett said nothing. She raised the rifle. One breath, one wind correction. One trigger squeeze. Steel rang. She worked the bolt and fired again. Then again. 3 rounds. 3 seconds. One impossibly tight group at a distance that would have humbled half the candidates on that range. Maddox's smirk was gone. The entire range had gone silent. And nobody, not a single person standing there, could explain what they had just witnessed. If this story stops you cold, subscribe and stay until the very end, because what's coming will shake you. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since before dawn, and it showed no signs of stopping. It came in hard, wind-driven sheets across Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek. Kind of rain that turned dirt paths into mud rivers and made every uncovered surface on an outdoor range feel like the inside of a cold shower. Nobody complained. Complaining about weather at Little Creek was the fastest way to mark yourself as someone who didn't belong there. The instructors didn't complain. The candidates didn't complain. The support staff didn't complain either, because the support staff had learned long ago that the less noise they made, the less attention they attracted. Avery Bennett made no noise at all, moved along the edge of the range with 2 hard-sided ammunition cases balanced in her arms and a third strapped across her back, picking her path through the mud with the kind of automatic efficiency that people develop when they've spent enough years carrying heavy things in uncomfortable places. She was 28 years old, 5 feet 6 inches, built lean in a way that read as unremarkable until you noticed the way she moved, which most people didn't, because she had spent the better part of 2 years working very hard at being the kind of person nobody looked at twice. The Armory support assignment at Little Creek had given her exactly what she'd asked for after everything fell apart. Quiet work, physical work. The kind of work where your value was measured in whether boxes arrived on time and equipment was properly logged, not in whether you could make a decision under fire that determined whether someone lived or died. She requested the posting herself, through channels that most people on the base didn't know existed, and Commander Rebecca Sloan had approved it without asking for a detailed explanation, because Sloan understood the way some people needed to step back from the edge before the edge consumed them entirely. 2 years. Avery had spent 2 years making herself invisible. She was very good at it. The Advanced Maritime Sniper Qualification course occupied the far end of Little Creek's outdoor range complex. Stretch of covered firing points and open steel that challenged candidates at distances most standard qualification programs never approached. The course was run by Senior Chief Cole Maddox, and it was well known across the base for 2 reasons. The first reason was that it produced technically capable shooters. The second reason was that it also produced a measurable number of candidates who left the program believing they were fundamentally inadequate human beings, which in Maddox's professional philosophy were not mutually exclusive outcomes. Avery had heard Maddox before she saw him. His voice carried even through rain. That was embarrassing. His tone didn't rise, it didn't need to. The flatness of it was worse than shouting would have been. The particular flatness of a man who had decided a long time ago that people only truly corrected their failures when they felt genuinely ashamed of them. You understand what I mean by embarrassing? I don't mean technically imperfect. I've seen technically imperfect. Technically imperfect. I can work with. What I just watched was a shooter who quit before the trigger broke. You quit. In front of your teammates, on a steel target that isn't shooting back at you. Avery slowed her pace without meaning to. Could see the firing line from where she was. 8 candidates stood in a staggered line behind their rifles, all of them still wearing their wet weather gear, all of them rigidly attentive in the way that people become rigidly attentive when the person doing the talking has demonstrated a willingness to make examples. The far end of the line, slightly separated from the others. Petty Officer Natalie Cruz. 26 years old, smaller than most of her cohort, with the kind of focus in her eyes that read like intensity or desperation depending on which direction things were going. Right now it read like desperation. Maddox was standing behind her. "Tell me what happened," he said out loud in front of everyone. Natalie's jaw worked. "My groups were drifting, Senior Chief. I know they were drifting. I watched them drift. I'm asking you why. I think my breathing." "You think," he repeated the phrase with a specific kind of contempt. The kind reserved for people who offered possibilities when certainties were expected. "You think you're breathing. What do you know?" The silence that followed lasted several seconds too long. Avery watched Natalie's hands tighten around the stock of her rifle, not in anger, but in the specific way that someone grips something solid when the ground underneath them has stopped feeling reliable. Avery recognized that grip. She had felt it herself once before. In a different life, she kept moving forward. The ammunition cases were heavy, and the armorer's station was 50 meters ahead, and this was not her training program, and these were not her candidates, and she had made a very deliberate choice 2 years ago to stop putting herself in situations where her decisions had consequences for other people. She was almost past the firing line when she noticed the optic. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that a person could miss entirely if they weren't looking, which was why everyone else apparently had missed it. Scope mount on Natalie Cruz's rifle had been improperly seated. The rear ring showed the barest fraction of a gap where it should have made solid contact with the rail, a gap narrow enough to pass a casual visual inspection, but significant enough to introduce an inconsistency that would shift points of impact unpredictably across a shot string. It wouldn't show up the same way twice. One shot might land clean. The next might drift. The shooter would adjust for a problem that wasn't in her technique at all, and every adjustment would put her further from the solution. Avery set down the ammunition cases. She didn't make a decision. Exactly, it wasn't that deliberate. She just stopped moving. And then she walked toward the armorer's station at the edge of the firing line. And she said quietly enough that it wasn't a spectacle, "Hey, that scope mount on the end rifle, check the rear ring. Not fully seated." The armorer looked at her. "What? The rear ring? It needs to come off and be properly retorqued before she fires another shot." The armorer was 22 years old and had been on the job for 6 months and was accustomed to receiving direction from a fairly limited roster of people, and Avery Bennett, weapons support technician, was not on that roster. He opened his mouth to say something along those lines. He didn't get the chance. "Since when?" said a voice from behind Avery. "Does supply staff teach my shooters?" She turned around. Maddox was looking at her the way a very large and very confident dog looks at something small that has wandered into its territory not threatened. Exactly, but calculating whether a demonstration was warranted. He was 45, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered competence in his face that came from genuine experience, and had curdled somewhere along the line into the assumption that experience alone was sufficient qualification for any opinion he chose to form. "I'm not teaching anyone," Avery said. Her voice was even. Not aggressive, not apologetic, not deferential, just even. "I noticed a problem with the equipment. I mentioned it to my armorer." Maddox took a step toward her. Round them, the candidates had gone very still on my range during my training evolution. "And what problem did you notice?" "Exactly, since you've got such a sharp eye from loading ammunition boxes." Avery looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Natalie's rifle, then back at Maddox. "Since your shooter was about to fail because of equipment." "Not ability," she said. The range went silent. Not the ordinary quiet of people waiting for a conversation to end. Specific silence of a place where something has shifted and nobody is yet certain which direction things are going to fall. Maddox held her gaze for a long moment, then walked past her toward Natalie's position and picked up the rifle himself. He examined the scope mount. He turned it over. He looked at the rear ring. He set the rifle down. He did not say anything about the scope mount. He did not say whether she was right. What he did was take the rifle from Natalie Cruz's position, hand it to the armorer with a look that communicated the armorer's professional future was going to require a great deal more careful attention, and then turn toward Avery with the particular calm of a man who has decided that direct anger is less effective than controlled force. "Step off the line," he said to Natalie. His tone was measured. "Take a break. Get your head right." Natalie's face went through something complicated and painful before settling into the blank expression that people wear when they're swallowing something they can't afford to show. She stepped back. She walked to the rear of the range, and as she passed Avery, so briefly that it might not have been intentional, she glanced at her with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite pleading but existed somewhere between the two. Then Maddox turned the full weight of his attention back to Avery. "What's your name?" "Bennett." "Avery Bennett. What's your job?" "Avery Bennett, weapon support. Armory logistics." Armory logistics, he repeated it with a flatness that she recognized, the same flatness he'd used on Natalie, the dismissiveness dressed up as professional disinterest. "And you've got enough expertise in armory logistics to identify scope mount problems that my instructors didn't catch, apparently." The word landed quietly, and Maddox's eyes narrowed. "How?" he asked. "I want to hear you explain it. Right here. Because we've got an armorer with 18 months of formal training and 3 certified instructors who walked past that rifle this morning, And you spotted something from 20 feet away while carrying boxes. So I want to understand what it is that Armory Logistics teaches you that apparently none of my people have figured out yet." Avery looked at him steadily. She was aware of the candidates watching. She was aware of Master Chief Owen Barrett, who had been standing at the rear of the firing line for the past several minutes, with the particular stillness of a man who is paying more careful attention than he appears to be paying. "I pay attention," she said. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Her silence had been uncertainty. This one was recognition, the specific recognition of people watching a confrontation in which one party has just declined to perform in the way the other party expected. And the situation hasn't resolved the way the confrontation's initiator wanted, which means the initiator is going to escalate. Maddox escalated. All right. He reached past the armorer and picked up a training rifle from the rack at the edge of the line. It was a bolt-action precision rifle, already equipped with a scope that Avery could tell from 20 feet away was neither the make nor the configurations she had ever personally trained with. He walked to her and placed it in her hands. The weight of it was immediate and familiar in a way she hadn't expected. Physical fact that her body remembered before her mind had fully processed what was happening. "Since you know so much about rifles," Maddox said, "why don't you demonstrate?" He pointed toward the far end of the range, not the standard qualification targets. Further, the steel plate mounted at the extreme limit of the range's operational distance, the one that the advanced candidates would work up to over several weeks, the one that required correct fundamentals and genuine familiarity with the specific platform and a clean windred and a shooter who had been warming up for hours, not someone who had been carrying ammunition boxes through rain. Around them, people were materializing. Candidates from both firing points. Instructors who had been running adjacent evolutions. The handful of base staff who had been crossing the range area when the confrontation started. Word moved quickly at Little Creek. It moved the way it always moved in small enclosed professional communities, faster than anyone planned and further than anyone intended. Avery looked at the rifle in her hands. She hadn't fired a precision rifle in almost 2 years. She hadn't wanted to. She had structured her entire existence at Little Creek around not wanting to. And she had been very successful at it. And now she was standing on a range with 40 people watching her and a rifle in her hands and a target 200 meters further than she had any business shooting at without preparation. And the memories were coming in, whether she invited them or not. Rain, radio chatter. The particular quality of silence over an open channel when someone stops transmitting. Logan Pierce's voice on the last night calmed the way he was always calm, running the wind call one more time before she broke the shot. And then the sound that wasn't supposed to happen, and the radio that stopped transmitting, and the knowledge that she'd gotten out, and the people she'd been there to protect had gotten out, and Logan had not. She had survived. She had never forgiven herself for surviving. Avery's hands tightened around the rifle. Maddox was watching her. He saw her stillness and he read it as hesitation, and he read hesitation as confirmation of the explanation he had already constructed for himself that she had gotten lucky with the scope mount, or had heard someone else mention it, or was some manner of fraud who had wandered onto his range and embarrassed his program, and was now about to be definitively exposed in front of everyone. He leaned forward. He was close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. She smirked. "You're finished." Avery looked at the target. She did not look at Maddox. She did not look at the candidates, or the instructors, or Barrett at the rear of the line. She looked at the target, and she looked at the way the wind was moving through the grass, in the middle distance, and she looked at the mirage shimmer at the edge of the range that told her more about what the air was doing than any mechanical read would have. And she thought about nothing except the calculation that the moment required. One breath, slow, deliberate, controlled. The breath of someone who had spent years learning to make the body into something that couldn't be startled. One wind correction. A quarter adjustment for the crosswind she could feel against the left side of her face. Squeeze. Not a pull. The distinction mattered, and she had known it mattered before she ever knew why. Crack. The steel plate at the far end of the range moved. Avery did not lower the rifle. She worked the bolt without thinking. The motion so ingrained it required no conscious participation. And she settled back behind the optic, and she found the target, and she fired again. Then again. 3 shots. 3 seconds. The steel plate swung with each impact. The metallic ring arriving half a second after the muzzle report, and when the echoes died, the range was silent in a way that it had not been silent since before anyone could remember. Nobody laughed. Maddox's smirk was gone. At the rear of the line, Master Chief Owen Barrett had been holding binoculars up to his eyes for the past 45 seconds, tracking the shots as they landed. He was 53 years old and had been around precision shooting for more than 30 of those years. He had seen a great many shooters demonstrate a great many things on a great many ranges. And he lowered the binoculars now, with the deliberate care of a man who needs a moment to process what he has just observed. 3 in-tight group. Not a lucky group. Not a beginner's group. A group that told a specific story about the shooter, about the way she had read the wind, about the way she had settled her position without any visible adjustment process, about the way she had managed the bolt between shots with a kind of automatic efficiency that you only develop after years of repetition. Barrett wasn't impressed. He was disturbed, because he recognized the technique. Avery Bennett hadn't shot like someone who had learned marksmanship as a secondary skill. She hadn't shot like someone who had trained at a civilian range on weekends, or had been taught the basics by an enthusiastic friend. She had shot like someone who had once, in conditions that did not permit error, depended on a single bullet to bring people home alive. Knew that shot. He had made that shot himself once, 20 years ago, and he had watched other people make it. And he knew what it looked like when someone wasn't performing for an audience, but was instead accessing something that lived far below the level of performance. Around him, people were starting to find their voices. He could hear the beginning of murmurs, the first tentative sounds of 40 people who had just watched something they couldn't entirely explain beginning to process it together. He could see Maddox's face working through something complicated, not quite anger, not quite shock, not quite humiliation, but a combination of all three that was going to require an outlet. Barrett didn't look at Maddox, he looked at Avery. She had set the rifle down. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking at the target. She was looking at her own hands with the specific expression of someone who had just been reminded of something they had been working very hard to put away, and the reminder had arrived whether they were ready for it or not. "Who are you?" someone in the crowd said. The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It came from somewhere in the middle of the gathered candidates. Half-asked, more confused than demanding, the kind of question that emerges when a situation has exceeded the explanations available. Nobody answered it. Maddox found his voice first. "Bennett." His tone had changed. Contempt was still there, but it was tighter now. Impressed by something else, the specific pressure of a man who has made a very public miscalculation and is doing the math on how to reframe the narrative before it sets. Explain yourself. Right now. Who cleared you to handle training equipment? Where did you learn to shoot like that? Avery looked at him. "I told you," she said. "I pay attention." "That is not an answer. It's the answer you're getting." Maddox took a step toward her. "Your personnel file." "I want to see your personnel file." "You're welcome to request it." "I am requesting it right now." Directly in front of witnesses. Avery picked up the ammunition cases she had set down several minutes earlier. The motion was unhurried, deliberate. The motion of someone who has decided that the scene has reached a natural conclusion and is proceeding accordingly. "Then you'll want to go through proper channels," she said. "I have a delivery to finish. You're not walking away from this range." She looked at him one more time. Something moved behind her eyes, not anger, not defiance. Something quieter and more settled than either of those things. "Senior Chief," she said, "your armorer has a scope mount to fix, and your shooter has been standing in the rain for 40 minutes already. I'd suggest you deal with your range before you deal with me." She walked. She walked, of the exact quality of the silence behind her, not the silence of a situation that had resolved, but the silence of one that had been suspended. She was aware of Maddox's breathing behind her, the particular caught-breath sound of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and is not yet certain what to do with that knowledge. She was aware of Barrett's gaze following her across the range, steady and appraising, in a way that felt different from the others. Not hostile and not admiring, but genuinely searching. The look of a man turning a problem over carefully. She was most aware of Natalie Cruz, standing at the edge of the rear area, watching her go. Natalie didn't say anything, she just watched. But her arms had uncrossed, and the grip she'd had on herself for the past 40 minutes, that tight, held-in tension of someone bracing for another blow, had loosened slightly. Not much. Avery kept walking. Behind her, she heard Maddox issue an instruction to one of his other instructors, sharp, clipped. The controlled anger of a man who knows a confrontation isn't over but needs to create the appearance of control. She heard the range beginning to resume, the sounds of a training evolution restarting, people finding their positions again, the mechanical noises of a program insisting on its own continuity. She heard Barrett's voice very quietly, saying something she couldn't make out. Then she heard nothing but rain. The armory at the south end of Little Creek's support complex was warm and dry, which was two things the rest of the base wasn't at that particular moment. And Avery spent the next hour logging equipment returns with the kind of careful, methodical attention that had made her genuinely useful in the role and had also served as the thing she did to stop thinking about other things. She was good at the work, good at most practical things. It was a quality that had served her across very different contexts over the years, and there was something honest about equipment that performed predictably and failed in diagnosable ways. People were considerably less predictable. People failed in ways that were not always diagnosable until after the fact. She was halfway through her second inventory sheet when specialist Marcus Webb knocked on the doorframe. He was the younger of the two full-time armory staff, eager in the specific way of people who were still in the phase of their careers where eagerness hadn't yet been complicated by experience. He was also currently wearing the expressions of someone carrying information they weren't entirely certain they should be carrying. "Hey, Bennett," he hesitated. "You know Senior Chief Maddox filed a request for your personnel file about 20 minutes ago?" Avery kept writing. "I heard he might. Through the admin office. Full access request. That'll take a while to process." "Yeah." Marcus paused. "I also heard, I wasn't there, but people who were there were talking in the break room. Did you really just walk up to that range and I spotted an equipment problem and reported it?" Avery said. "Then I was asked to demonstrate something. I demonstrated it. That's the whole story." "Right." Marcus didn't look entirely convinced that it was the whole story. "It's just people are saying you put 3 rounds in a group at the extreme end of the range, with an unfamiliar rifle. First time behind it. People talk, they do." He lingered in the doorway another moment. Were they wrong? Avery set down her pen. She looked at the inventory sheet. Then she picked the pen back up. "Finish logging the returns from the morning session," she said. "Barometric numbers on the test equipment from Range 3 need to be updated before the afternoon cycle." Marcus opened his mouth, and then apparently thought better of it, and came into the armory and picked up his own clipboard and started working. They worked in silence for a while. It was the best kind of silence, functional, purposeful, the silence of two people doing useful things. And Avery was almost comfortable in it when she heard steps in the corridor outside that she recognized by cadence before she saw the person. Long stride. Deliberate weight distribution. The walk of someone who had spent years in wet terrain and narrow passages and had long since lost the instinct for walking softly on hard floors. Barrett filled the doorway. He was a big man, not in the aggressive way that Maddox was big, but in the way of someone who had simply been built for physical work and had spent a career doing it. His face was the face of a man who had seen a great deal and had arrived at the conclusion that most things were less surprising than people believed them to be, which made the thing currently in his expression more interesting. He was surprised. He hadn't decided what to do with the surprise yet. But it was there Bennett. He didn't step inside. He stood in the doorway and looked at her across the armory space with the appraising calm of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating people and knew how to make it not feel like an evaluation even when it was. "Finish your shift yet?" "2 more hours. Walk with me when you do." It wasn't a question. And it wasn't quite an order. Barrett was not technically in her chain of command for armory logistics, but it was the kind of statement that carried the weight of someone who understood the difference between authority and presence and had enough of the latter to make the former irrelevant. She asked. Barrett looked at her for a long moment. "Because I want to understand something," he said. "And I think you probably need to talk to someone who's going to actually listen instead of just looking for what they want to find." He left without waiting for her answer. Avery looked at the doorway he'd vacated. She looked at the inventory sheet on the table in front of her. She thought about the way the rifle had felt in her hands, the immediate, terrible familiarity of it, the body's memory overriding 2 years of deliberate forgetting. She thought about Natalie Cruz's expression as she'd walked away, picked up her pen and went back to work. Maddox spent the afternoon doing 2 things simultaneously, and both of them were the kind of activities that people engage in when they have been publicly embarrassed and are looking for a way to reconfigure the narrative. The first thing was requesting Avery's personnel file through every channel available to him, which produced a consistent response, a series of administrative holds and restriction codes and authorization requirements above his clearance level that together formed a picture of a file that someone, at some point, had worked very hard to make inaccessible to casual inquiry. The second thing was interviewing people who had been present on the range, which produced a series of accounts so consistent and specific that by early afternoon he had no reasonable means of questioning what had happened, even if he'd wanted to. 3 rounds, 1 tight group, unfamiliar rifle, extreme distance, first time behind the weapon. He had access to the range camera footage, and he watched it twice, and the footage confirmed everything. everyone was saying. And he closed the footage and sat with his hands flat on his desk for several minutes before his temper surpassed his self-control. He called his senior instructor, Petty Officer First Class Donovan, into his office. "What do you know about her?" he asked. Donovan had been on the range. He was 34 and technically proficient and smart enough to understand that his boss was not actually asking what he knew, but was asking to be pointed toward an explanation that was useful. "Not much," he said carefully. "She's been here almost 2 years. Armory logistics. Before that, nothing in the accessible record. Nothing I can reach. There are restriction codes on her pre-assignment history that I've never actually seen before. The kind that usually mean—" "I know what they usually mean." Maddox's jaw tightened. "I want to know how a weapons support tech learned to shoot like that." "I don't think she learned it as a weapons support tech. That's the whole problem, isn't it?" Donovan chose silence, which was generally the right choice. Maddox stood up and went to his window. He looked out at the range, which was running an afternoon evolution now, candidates cycling through their positions in the rain. He thought about the morning. He thought about the way Avery had set down those ammunition boxes and walked to his armorer and said something so quietly that he almost hadn't heard her. He thought about the way she'd taken the rifle from him, without any visible reaction, no performance. No declaration, no drama. She had simply accepted the weapon and shot it. And the absence of performance was, in retrospect, more telling than the shot itself. People who were demonstrating something made a show of the demonstration. People who were simply doing what they had always done didn't. "Find out who authorized her assignment here," he said. "And find out what's above those restriction codes. I don't care what you have to file to get it, Senior Chief." Donovan paused. "Those kinds of restriction codes, if someone doesn't want them accessed, they're usually not going to become accessible just because you file paperwork. Then I'll find another way." Maddox turned from the window. "In the meantime, tell Cruz she's back on the line tomorrow morning." Full qualification sequence. Donovan looked at him. "She's not ready. Not after this morning. Then she better get ready. Because ready or not, she's firing tomorrow." He sat back down. "And tell her she's not getting any additional coaching time." Donovan left without saying what he was thinking, which was the appropriate professional response. But he said it in the hallway to himself instead, quietly, as he walked back toward the range. Natalie Krugsu found Avery in the south parking lot at the end of the shift. She hadn't planned what she was going to say, which was evident from the way she arrived, walking quickly, then slowing when she got close, then stopping about 6 feet away with her hands in her pockets, and her jaw set in the expression of someone who is prepared for a version of a conversation that now doesn't seem like the right version. Avery was loading equipment into a storage vehicle, and she didn't stop when she heard the footsteps, just shifted slightly to make clear she was aware of the approach and wasn't concerned by it. "Bennett," Natalie said. "Cruz." Natalie stopped, started again. "I wanted to say thank you for the scope mount thing." "I know you didn't have to say anything. I noticed a problem with equipment," Avery said. "Reporting equipment problems is part of my job. It's not actually. Not on the qualification range." Avery didn't answer that. Natalie took a breath. "I've been on this course for 11 weeks, she said. "I was scoring well through the first 6, top of my cohort through the qualification progressions. Then Maddox, I don't know what changed. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe he just... I'm losing my groups. Not because my fundamentals are wrong. I know they're not wrong. I can feel the difference between a clean shot and a shot I've pushed. And I'm pushing everything now because every time I get behind that rifle, I can hear his voice, telling me what I'm going to do wrong before I've done it." She said it quietly and directly, without self-pity, the way that people describe problems they're trying to solve, rather than looking for comfort about. Avery closed the storage compartment. She leaned against the vehicle. She looked at Natalie with the careful attention of someone who has heard a version of this problem before and understands it from the inside. "You're managing him," she said. Natalie frowned. "What? When you're behind the rifle? You're not managing the shot. You're managing him. You're building in adjustments for what he's going to say before you've even pulled the trigger. Which means you're firing 2 shots every time the real one and the one you've already pre-corrected for his opinion. They're not hitting the same place." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "How do you fix that?" she asked. "Stop shooting to impress him," Avery said. "He's not the target. He's not the wind. He's not the distance. He's not any part of the equation. Shoot to control yourself. That's the only variable you actually have access to." Natalie looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like you've been behind a rifle before," she said. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious. The particular curiosity of someone who has just received advice that is too specific to have come from observation alone. Avery pushed off from the vehicle. "Get some rest," she said. "You've got a long day tomorrow." She started to walk. "Maddox is going to call me back to the line tomorrow morning," Natalie said to her back. "Donovan told me an hour ago. No additional proof time." Avery stopped. "He's been wanting to remove me from the course," Natalie continued. "He doesn't think I belong here. He said it not to me directly, but to Donovan. And Donovan told Martinez. And Martinez told me because people talk at Little Creek. He's going to put me on the line tomorrow in front of everyone and watch me fail, so he has justification for the removal." Avery stood with her back to Natalie for a moment. "Then don't fail," she said. "I need help. I'm not an instructor. I know what you are." Natalie's voice was steady. "Don't know the details. Nobody does, except apparently the people whose clearance is high enough to open your file. But I know what I saw this morning, and I know that you knew what was wrong with my equipment before you were close enough to examine it, and I know that what you just told me about shooting to control yourself instead of shooting to impress him is the most accurate description of my problem that anyone has given me in 11 weeks. She paused. "I'm not asking you to shoot for me. I'm asking you to help me figure out how to stop getting in my own way." Avery turned around. She looked at Natalie Cruz for a long time. She thought about 11 weeks. She thought about someone who had come into a program scoring at the top of her cohort and had systematically had her confidence dismantled by a man who believed that breaking people down was the same as building them up. She thought about herself, at 23, working with Logan Pierce for the first time, how he'd watched her adjust for his corrections before he'd even finished giving them, how he'd said afterward the first session that she had good instincts, but she was spending too much energy managing the relationship with her instructor and not enough energy managing the relationship with her rifle. How that one piece of observation had changed something fundamental in the way she approached the work. She thought about Logan. She always thought about Logan. Eventually. "One session," she said, "before dawn tomorrow. There's a covered practice area at the East Range Annex. I'll be there at 0430. She looked directly at Natalie. You're not getting a cheerleader. You're getting someone who is going to tell you specifically what you're doing wrong and make you fix it yourself. That's the deal." Natalie didn't smile. This wasn't a smiling moment. But something shifted in her expression, the particular settling of someone who has been bracing against a force and has suddenly been given something solid to brace against instead. 4:30, she said in Cruz. Avery's voice was level. "What happened on the range this morning doesn't leave that parking lot. Whatever you think you know about me, you don't know it." "Understood." Natalie held her gaze. "Understood," she said. Avery walked to her vehicle. The rain had eased slightly. Not stopped, the forecast hadn't promised anything better, but eased. Thinned out to a quieter persistence that felt less aggressive than the morning had. She sat in the vehicle for a moment before starting the engine, her hands on the steering wheel, aware of the particular tiredness that came not from physical exertion but from the effort of being present in a situation that required more of her than she had been planning to give. She thought about the rifle in her hands that morning, the weight and balance of it, the immediate instinctive orientation toward the target, calculations that had arrived without her asking for them: wind, distance, position, breath, the entire process happening below the level of conscious decision in the way it always had, in the way that years of practice had built into her nervous system as something that couldn't be fully unlearned no matter how firmly she'd decided to step away from it. She thought about the sound of the steel target ringing across the range. 3 shots. She thought about Maddox's face as the third ring arrived. Thought, with the specific clarity that comes at the end of a complicated day, about what Barrett had said in the armory doorway. "I think you probably need to talk to someone who's going to actually listen instead of just looking for what they want to find." She started the engine. Above the base, the sky was the flat, bruised gray of a Virginia winter afternoon, and the rain fell on the range and the armory and the parking lot and the covered firing points, indifferent to all the stories being constructed beneath it. In his office, Cole Maddox pulled up Avery's file for the 3rd time and found the same restriction codes and authorization holds and clearance requirements, and he sat with them for a long time. And the longer he sat with them, the more certain he became that whatever was behind those codes was the key to a problem he hadn't yet fully defined. In the South Range area, Owen Barrett walked the covered range annex alone in the rain, his hands in his pockets, turning something over in his mind with the careful patience of a man who has learned that most things become clearer if you give them enough time. And in the east parking lot, Avery Bennett sat in her vehicle and looked at her hands in the low light, and thought about tomorrow, and thought about what she had just agreed to, and thought about a conversation she'd had with Logan Pierce a very long time ago on a rain-soaked Overwatch position somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, in which he'd said something that she'd been trying to forget and hadn't been able to. "You can't run from what you know how to do," he'd said. "You can only decide who you do it for." She pulled out of the parking lot and drove into the gray afternoon. Behind her, Little Creek continued its routines. But something had shifted, and everyone who had been on that range knew it, and the shift was the kind that didn't quietly correct itself. It was the kind that kept going. The silence on that range lasted exactly 4 seconds. Avery knew because she counted them. It was an old habit, the kind that gets built into a person during the years, when 4 seconds of silence on an open radio channel meant something had gone catastrophically wrong.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Then the range came back to life all at once. 40 people, finding their voices simultaneously, and she was already walking, already putting distance between herself and the rifle she'd set back on the rack, and the 3 holes in a piece of steel that she couldn't unmake, no matter how much she was beginning to wish she could. She heard Maddox behind her, Bennett. She kept walking. "Bennett, I'm talking to you." She stopped, not because she felt obligated to, because she knew from long experience that walking away from a man like Maddox when he was in that particular register of voice tight, controlled, the anger compressed down to a sharp point created more problems than it solved. Turned around. His face had reorganized itself from the shock she'd seen immediately after the 3rd shot. He'd had maybe 30 seconds to work with, and he'd used them well. The expression he was wearing now was the one he defaulted to when the world had not performed according to his expectations, not embarrassment, not acknowledgement, but a kind of aggressive inquiry, as if the universe owed him a better explanation and he intended to extract it. "You do not walk off my range," he said. "My shift ended 4 minutes ago," Avery said. "I delivered the equipment. The range is supplied. I'm walking off your range. After what just happened." "What happened," Avery said clearly, for the benefit of everyone still watching, "is that I fired a rifle when you asked me to. That's the complete list of things that happened." She looked at him steadily. "If you have a problem with the way I shot it, file the paperwork." She turned and walked. Time he let her go. But she heard him very clearly, speaking to Donovan as she reached the far edge of the range area. She heard her name. She heard the word records. She heard the specific tone of a man who has decided that understanding something is the same as controlling it, and who has therefore decided that understanding is his next priority. She walked faster. Behind her, Owen Barrett watched Maddox and Donovan with the patient attention of a man cataloging information he wasn't yet ready to use. The rain came down harder. The range resumed. And the thing that Avery had spent 2 years carefully not starting had started anyway. She had known, somewhere beneath all the deliberate ordinariness of the past 24 months, that it was going to. You could not put away what you were. You could put it in a different room and close the door and learn to stop thinking about it every time you walked past. But the room was still there, and the door opened both ways. She drove back to her quarters with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and Logan Pierce's voice in her head the way it always was when she'd done something that reminded her of him. "Don't overthink the aftermath," he used to say. "The shot's done. Move to what's next." What was next was Barrett's voice in the armory doorway, and Natalie Cruz at 0430 and Cole Maddox with her personnel file open on his screen, running into restriction codes he didn't have the clearance to pass. What was next was exactly the kind of complicated she'd come to Little Creek to avoid. She parked. She went inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time without taking her jacket off. Then she set her alarm for 0400 and lay back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she did, and when the alarm went off she was already awake. The East Range Annex was empty at 0430. The way places are empty in the pre-dawn hours when the rest of the world is still constructing the day. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was a habit she'd never managed to break regardless of context, and she used the 7 minutes to check the available equipment and the positioning of the covered shooting bay and the angles of the approach routes, which was also a habit she'd never managed to break regardless of context. Natalie Cruz arrived exactly on time. She came in out of the dark wearing her cold weather gear and carrying a rifle case, and she set the case down on the bench and unzipped it without preamble. And Avery recognized immediately that whatever complicated emotional weather Natalie had been carrying through the previous day had been compressed overnight into something harder and more functional. She wasn't here to talk about her feelings, she was here to fix a problem. "Good, show me your setup," Avery said. Natalie set up her position prone, consistent with what Avery had observed on the range, and she did it competently. No obvious errors in the process itself. Avery watched without comment until she was settled. Now dry fire, Avery said 5 times. Don't think about me. Don't think about Maddox. Don't think about the qualification. Just fire. Natalie dry fired 5 times. Avery crouched beside her and watched her trigger hand. Watched her breathing. Watched the almost imperceptible movement that happened in her shoulders at the moment the trigger would have broken. The tiny bracing motion of someone who has been conditioned to expect criticism at the moment of the shot and is physically preparing for it half a second before it arrives. Stop, Avery said. Natalie stopped. You're flinching before the break, I know, Natalie said. I've been trying to... You're not flinching because of the recoil, Avery said. You're flinching because of him. Your body has learned that the moment after the shot is when the bad thing happens. So it's already contracting for the blow before the round is even gone. She paused. That's not a shooting problem. That's a conditioning problem. And it's fixable. Natalie was quiet for a moment. How? By separating the shot from his response. In your head, those two things have become one event. The shot and his judgment arrive simultaneously. We're going to pull them apart. Avery stood up. Dry fire again. This time, after the trigger breaks, I want you to say the word done out loud, not to me. To yourself. Loud enough that you can hear it. I'm sorry. It sounds simple. It is simple. Simple works. Fire. Done, she said. Quiet, uncertain. But done. Done, her voice was steadier. What you're doing, Avery said, is giving your brain a clean stopping point that belongs to you, not to him. The shot happens, and then you say done, and everything after that, his voice, his face, his opinion that comes after done. And after done is not part of the shot. It's separate, it can't touch the shot. She watched Natalie fire twice more. Done. Natalie's voice was different now. Not loud but settled. They worked for 40 minutes. No live ammunition. Avery wasn't going to fire live rounds in an annex range at 4:30 in the morning without authorization, and Natalie knew enough not to ask. But dry fire done correctly was not nothing. Dry fire done correctly was a surgical intervention in the specific chain of physical responses that had been derailing Natalie's groups for weeks, and Avery ran her through it with the particular focused patience of someone who understood what it felt like to have a reliable thing become unreliable because of someone else's voice in your head. She knew exactly what that felt like. She'd had to rebuild that herself, once, in different circumstances under a different kind of pressure. But the architecture of the problem was the same. At 5:15, Avery called it. That's enough, she said. Go get breakfast. Get your head quiet when you get behind the rifle today. You're not shooting for him, and you're not shooting for me, and you're not shooting to prove anything to anyone who was on that range yesterday. She looked at Natalie directly. You're shooting for the qualification. That's a standard. Standards don't have opinions, they just measure. Natalie packed up the rifle case. She straightened up and looked at Avery, with the expression of someone who is about to say something, and isn't entirely sure it will land correctly. Why are you doing this? She asked. Avery picked up her own gear. Because the equipment problem was real, and your technique problem is real, and both of them had the same cause. And it bothered me. That's not the whole reason. Avery looked at her. The reason you're getting, she said. Natalie almost smiled. Not quite. But almost. She left. Avery stood in the empty annex for a moment after the footsteps faded. She looked at the covered range, at the target frames in the gray pre-dawn dimness, at the bench where Natalie had been lying prone with her rifle and her dry-fire repetitions and her growing steadiness. Thought about 40 minutes ago, when she had crouched beside Natalie and said the words that Logan had said to her on a training range in the Nevada desert 8 years earlier, almost word for word. She hadn't planned to use them. They had arrived because they were the right words for the problem. They were the right words for the problem because Logan had built them precisely for exactly this kind of problem. And the fact that the words still worked 8 years later and a world away from where she'd first heard them was something. She wasn't ready to name what it was, but it was something. She walked out into the pre-dawn. Barrett was leaning against the wall outside. Avery stopped. He straightened up without apparent surprise. The way a man straightens up who has been waiting exactly as long as he expected to wait and is not startled by the conversation that has now arrived. How long have you been out here? She asked. Long enough, he said. Walk with me. It was not a question. It was the same tone as yesterday's doorway statement. And she understood it the same way, not as a command she was obligated to follow, but as an invitation from someone who had something worth hearing. She walked with him. Barrett walked the way he talked, unhurried and deliberate, with the settled quality of someone who had learned long ago that speed was rarely the variable that changed outcomes. He moved through the pre-dawn base, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving in the automatic scanning pattern that people develop when they have spent years in environments where what you didn't see was more important than what you did. Avery noticed him noticing things. She noticed it because she was doing the same thing. And he noticed her noticing him. And something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but the particular satisfaction of a hypothesis being confirmed. "Tell me about the scope mount," he said. "I spotted an equipment problem and reported it. You spotted it from 20 feet away. Through rain while carrying boxes." "I was paying attention." "Yes." Barrett was quiet for a moment. "You always are, aren't you? You came into the break room last Tuesday, and you sat with your back to the corner and your face to the door, and you tracked every person who walked in for the first 4 minutes without appearing to look at any of them." He paused. "I noticed because I do the same thing, and I stopped doing it consciously about 15 years ago." Avery said nothing. "You check exits," he continued. "When you came into the range yesterday morning, set the boxes down, you identified every exit point in that structure. I watched you do it. It took you about 3 seconds. And then you were done, and you looked like someone who had just with ammunition boxes and nothing else on her mind." He glanced at her. "That kind of awareness doesn't come from armory logistics. It comes from paying attention," Avery said. "Stop saying that." His voice was quiet, not harsh, just firm in the way of someone who is tired of the deflection and is requesting, plainly, that it stop. Avery walked. "You're not hiding what you can do," Barrett said. "I figured that out yesterday. If you were trying to hide what you could do, you'd have kept walking past that range instead of stopping for the scope mount." He let that sit for a moment. "You're hiding what happened when you did it." The words landed with the specific weight of something accurate. Avery felt her pace change, a fractional slowdown, the body's involuntary response to being seen more clearly than it was prepared for. She brought it back to normal within a single stride. But Barrett was the kind of person who noticed single strides. "Who was he?" Barrett asked. She looked at him sharply. "Person you lost," he said. "Everybody who carries what you're carrying lost someone specific. It's never abstract, it's always a name." He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking straight ahead. "I lost a guy named Franklin Reyes in Ramadi in 2005. Best spotter I ever worked with. I spent 4 years after that behind a desk because I couldn't trust myself in the field. Not because my skills were gone, because I couldn't separate his death from what I was doing when he died." He paused. "I'll ask again, who was he?" Avery was quiet for a long time. The base was beginning to come alive around them. The first lights in the mess building, the distant sound of a vehicle starting, the base working its way back into its operational rhythms with the incremental determination of an institution that did not stop for grief or rain or the private histories of the people who moved through it. "Logan Pierce," she said. She hadn't said his name out loud to anyone at Little Creek. 22 months, and she hadn't said it once. It sat differently in the open air than it did in her head, heavier, somehow, and also less catastrophic. Names became more manageable when you stopped treating them like things that would break you if you touched them. "Spotter?" Barrett asked. My spotter, and she stopped. "He was my closest friend. We came up together. He taught me more about precision shooting than any program I ever went through." She walked 3 more steps. "He died in the Eastern Mediterranean during an extraction. Our position was compromised. I got the people we were protecting out. Logan didn't make it. And you made the decision to extract." "Yes. And if you'd stayed, then the people we were protecting would have had no overwatch and they'd have been walking into a kill zone." Her voice was even. She'd had the conversation with herself too many times to let the words shake her the way they used to. He would have made the same call. He would have been right to make the same call. "I know." Paused. "I know it, and it doesn't fix anything." Barrett nodded slowly. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They walked. "You requested this assignment," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. Because you wanted to disappear, because I wanted a job where nobody got hurt based on whether I performed correctly. And how's that working?" The question was delivered without inflection, without judgment, just the clean directness of a man who asks questions he already knows the partial answer to, because he wants to hear what the other person says about the parts he doesn't know. Avery looked at him. "Yesterday happened," she said. "Yesterday happened," he agreed. "And this morning happened. And now Cruz is going to go out on that range today, and she's going to shoot better than she's shot in 6 weeks. And Maddox is going to know that something changed. And he's going to trace it back here, and the conversation is going to arrive whether you want it to or not." He stopped walking. He turned to face her fully, which was a thing he'd been deliberately not doing, and the directness of it after the walking B-side conversation changed the register. I've been doing this for 30 years, Bennett. I know what the people who are truly finished look like, and I know what the people who are pretending to be finished look like. He looked at her steadily. You aren't hiding from the rifle. You're afraid that you're still exactly as good as you ever were. Because if you still are, then you have to make a decision about what that means. The words hit somewhere that Avery's careful 2-year construction had not fully insulated. She held his gaze. What classification level are you cleared to, she asked. Barrett blinked once. TSSCI, he said, with Welsh additional compartments for my time. Avery studied him. Logan Pierce died 17 months into our assignment to a classified maritime counterterrorism unit operating out of Naval Special Warfare Command, she said. Her voice was careful and level, the voice of someone reciting information they have decided to recite rather than one that has escaped. The unit was attached to SEAL team operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. My role was classified precision shooting overwatch, interdiction support, hostage rescue perimeter. The extraction that killed Logan was the 14th operational mission I'd been on. He died because our position was leaked. We still don't know by whom. She paused. I filed for reassignment 4 days after the debrief. I've been here since. Barrett was quiet for a long moment. How many missions did the sealed record show, he asked. 14 operational. 22 support. In how long? 31 months. Barrett exhaled slowly through his nose. The math was apparent to anyone who had spent time in special operations environments. 31 months. 14 operational, 22 support. That was not a support role that had occasionally been near the sharp end. That was someone who had been at the sharp end consistently, in a classification category that very few people even knew existed. The restriction codes on your file, he said. I tried to look them up this morning. I've got enough clearance to see that they exist, not what's behind them. Nobody at this base does, Avery said. Except Sloan. Commander Sloan knows. She authorized the assignment. Barrett processed this. And Maddox, he said. Maddox has none of it. Something moved in Avery's voice. Not pleasure at that fact. Not satisfaction, just the flat recognition of a situation as it existed. Filed for my personnel file yesterday afternoon. He's going to hit the same wall everyone at his clearance level hits. Authorization codes he can't pass. Service history that's been restricted to the point where it looks like I materialized at Little Creek from nowhere. She looked at Barrett. Which means he's going to do the other thing. Which is escalate on what he can control. His range, his training program, his authority within the boundaries of this base and this course. Barrett's jaw tightened slightly. Cruise. She's his next move, Avery said. I showed him up in front of his candidates and his instructors. He can't touch me directly because he doesn't understand what I am, and his file request is going nowhere. He's going to go after the thing adjacent to me, the candidate I interfered to protect. He's going to put her on the line today under conditions designed to make her fail. And when she fails, he's going to remove her from the course and document it as a performance-based decision. She paused. And it will look exactly like what it's documented as. Because that's how men like Maddox operate. They make their cruelty look like standards. Barrett looked at her for a long moment. You've been watching people like him for a while, he said. Long enough to know the pattern. And the session this morning was 40 minutes of dry fire fundamentals, Avery said. I didn't coach her in anything she didn't already have. I just helped her separate her technique from his voice. She met Barrett's eyes. It may not be enough. I don't know if 40 minutes fixes 6 weeks of systematic damage. But you tried. I tried. Barrett looked away. He looked at the base coming to life around them. The institutional machinery of a place built around the proposition that people could be trained to perform under conditions that would break most other people. Proposition that was sometimes true and sometimes used as justification for breaking people without the inconvenience of producing anything functional on the other side. Maddox is good at his job, he said, and his voice carried the specific weight of someone making an honest statement they wish weren't honest. Technically, he's one of the best instructors we have. His pass rates on the final qualification are above program average. His candidates' marksmanship fundamentals are consistently strong. He paused. He's also been removing candidates at a rate that's 30% above historical norm for this course. And when I looked at the removal documentation, which I did 3 months ago, because something felt wrong, the justifications are always technically defensible. Performance below standard. Attitude unsuitable for the operational environment. Inability to perform under pressure. He turned back to Avery. They're always defensible. And they're always, when you look at the full picture, the candidates who either pushed back against him or who he decided weren't worth his time for reasons that had nothing to do with ability. Avery looked at him carefully. You've been building a file. I've been observing, he said. There's a difference, is there? Barrett was quiet for a moment. I needed more, he said. What I had was patterns and instincts. Not evidence, not the kind of thing that goes in a report that results in action. He looked at her with the directness of a man making a decision as he spoke it. Yesterday changed that. I'm not a witness, Avery said immediately. My involvement stays off any documentation. My record is sealed for reasons that have nothing to do with Maddox and everything to do with operations that cannot be exposed. I know that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying that what happened yesterday, what you told me this morning, and what Cruz is going to do on that range today, all of that is going to accelerate something that was already moving. He paused. And I'm saying, you should know that it's moving so you're not caught off guard when it arrives. Avery looked at him. In her experience, which was broader than her personnel file reflected, there were two kinds of senior people in institutions like this one. The first kind used their experience as justification for protecting the existing structure, regardless of what the structure was doing. The second kind used their experience as the precise tool for identifying when the structure had stopped serving the people it was supposed to serve, and then acted on that identification regardless of the professional cost. Barrett was the second kind. She had suspected it from the moment he'd appeared in the armory doorway. The conversation this morning confirmed it. What are you going to do? She asked. Watch, he said, for now. Today I'm going to watch Maddox put Cruz on that line and watch what happens. And then I'm going to decide what to do about what I see. He put his hands back in his pockets. And I'm going to need you to stay available. I'm not operational. I'm not asking you to be operational. I'm asking you to stay available. He looked at her directly. There's a difference between those two things, too. Avery held his gaze for a long moment. I'll be at the range at 0800, she said. For the equipment delivery. Barrett nodded once. Slowly good. He turned and walked back toward the main complex. Avery watched him go. The pre-dawn gray was lightening toward morning. Somewhere on the far side of the base, the mess hall had opened, and the first sounds of an institutional day beginning voices. Doors, the particular percussion of a large space coming to life drifted across the wet air. She stood for a moment, just stood, feeling the weight of the morning that had already happened and the weight of the day that was coming. She thought about Logan. She thought about the way he used to assess situations, not in the linear, one thing after another fashion that most people used, but in a kind of simultaneous comprehension, holding all the moving parts at once and finding the pattern in their relationships to each other. It was the thing about him that she had never fully been able to replicate, the thing she'd been working toward when everything stopped. Told her once that it wasn't a skill exactly. It was a practice. It was what happened when you stopped trying to control every variable and started paying attention to how the variables were moving relative to each other. She thought about Barrett, and Natalie, and Maddox's file request, and the restriction codes, and Sloane's office at the far end of the command building. She thought about the shot she'd made yesterday, the 3 shots. The way her body had known what to do before she'd consciously decided to do it. The way the whole calculation had arrived complete and ready, without her having to construct it piece by piece. She thought about what Barrett had said. You're afraid that you're still exactly as good as you ever were. She stood in the pre-dawn and breathed and let the thought exist without trying to resolve it. Then she walked toward the mess hall for coffee and the day ahead. The range was running at full capacity by 0800. Avery arrived with the equipment delivery exactly on schedule, moving through the same routines as any other day, and nobody looking at her from the outside would have seen anything different in her posture or pace. She had gotten very good at that particular skill, the skill of carrying something significant on the inside while projecting perfect operational ordinariness on the outside. It was a skill that had been required of her in places where the alternative was not merely professional embarrassment, but the kind of outcome that didn't allow for a debrief. She registered the scene in the time it took to cross the range area. Natalie Cruz was at the end of the firing line. Maddox was running the line himself rather than delegating to Donovan, which was unusual. He was at the far end, crossed, positioned where he had the best sight line to Natalie's position, which was not a coincidence. The other candidates were firing. Natalie was waiting for her turn. She was standing very still, which from this distance looked like calm, and Avery knew was actually the particular stillness of someone who has prepared as thoroughly as possible and is now at the mercy of whether the preparation holds. Avery set down her equipment cases at the armorer's station. The armorer, a different one from yesterday, younger, no involvement in the previous day's events, signed for the delivery without looking up. Avery did not look directly at Natalie. She logged the delivery, double-checked the equipment receipt, and moved to the secondary station to sort the additional materials for the afternoon cycle, all of which required her to remain in the range area for a legitimate, documented professional reason. Maddox called Cruz to the line. The other candidates stepped back. Avery focused on the equipment in front of her and listened. Full qualification sequence, Maddox said. His voice carried the crisp authority of a man who has decided that today will go a specific way and has arranged the variables accordingly. Standard distances, standard time limits. No modifications, Natalie acknowledged and got behind the rifle. The first stage was at the nearest qualification distance. It was the simplest stage, designed to establish baseline before the difficulty escalated. Natalie fired her string. Avery didn't look. She listened to the report of the shots and the ring of the steel and the specific rhythm of the firing, the spacing between shots, the pauses, the pace. The pauses were correct. The rhythm was steady. The hits rang with the consistency of a shooter who is managing a clean sequence. Had nothing. Second stage. Longer distance. Tighter time limit. Natalie fired. Avery listened. Consistent. Controlled. The same steadiness in the rhythm that had been in the first stage. She heard, very faintly, something shift in the ambient noise of the other candidates, the specific sound of people who have been expecting something to go wrong, realizing that it isn't going wrong. Third stage. Maddox walked to Natalie's position between stages. Avery heard his voice drop, not quiet enough to be private, just quiet enough to be deniable. She couldn't hear the words, could hear the tone, the flatness, the specific, calibrated pressure of a man who is trying to reintroduce the voice into the sequence right before the sequence becomes hardest. Natalie fired the third stage. The hits rang. Avery allowed herself to exhale. She heard Barrett's voice from somewhere to her left, quiet, directed at Donovan, asking a specific technical question about the afternoon schedule that had nothing to do with what was happening on the line, but required Donovan's attention, and therefore positioned Barrett within clear sightline of everything unfolding. Smart. Fourth stage, moving targets. The hardest in the sequence. One that collapsed everything that had been built in the first three stages by introducing unpredictability. Natalie fired. 3 hits, 1 miss, then a hit, acceptable. Standard. Maddox's voice flat as a blade. You dropped one. Yes, Senior Chief. Natalie's voice was steady. I tracked the transition and the lead was insufficient. Smirked on the next, I noticed. Silence. Final stage, Maddox said. The final stage was Maddox's modification. Avery had learned this from Donovan, not directly, but through the specific chain of information that moved through Little Creek's tight professional community. Maddox had constructed a final stage that wasn't in the standard qualification sequence. 1 target. Extreme distance. 1 round. The same challenge he'd used to try to humiliate Avery the day before. He was using it on Natalie. Avery's hands went still on the equipment she was sorting. She heard Natalie settle into position. Heard the specific quality of the silence that gathered before a precision shot the held breath of everyone watching. The stillness of a moment, compressing itself around a single point of decision. 1 breath, the trigger broke, the steel rang, the sound traveled back across the range and arrived clean and clear and unambiguous. Dead silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the watching candidates, one person started to applaud, just one for exactly 2 seconds. Then they stopped, because they remembered where they were and who was watching. But those 2 seconds existed. They couldn't be unrung any more than the steel could be. Maddox stood very still. Avery looked at him directly for the first time. Face was doing the same calculation it had done the day before. But this time the math was different. Yesterday he'd been surprised and had responded with aggression. Today he'd constructed the situation himself, chosen the target and the distance and the parameters. And Natalie Cruz had hit the target he'd designed to defeat her using a tool he hadn't known she'd had access to. And the defeat was entirely of his own construction. He knew that. She could see that. He knew that. He looked across the range. And his gaze found Avery. She was holding a clipboard. He looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like, support staff doing equipment administration at the edge of an active range. She looked like someone who had been there the whole time doing nothing of consequence. Maddox's jaw tightened. He looked away. He dismissed Cruz with a clipped return to your position and called the range back into its standard sequence and walked to the rear of the line where Barrett was standing. And Barrett watched him come with the patient, unmoved attention of a man who has been waiting for this specific conversation for longer than the other party realizes. Avery kept her eyes on her clipboard. She heard Maddox's voice, low and tight, who coached her. Barrett said, I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Between yesterday and this morning, something changed in Cruz's technique. Someone worked with her. Candidates study and self-correct, Barrett said. It happens. Not at that rate. Then maybe your assessment of her previous performance wasn't as accurate as you believed it was. Silence. Avery could feel the specific quality of Maddox's anger from 20 meters away. The kind that doesn't express itself as raised voices but as a compressed, contained force looking for the correct outlet. She recognized it because she had stood in the vicinity of it before, different contexts, and she knew that anger in that register always eventually found an outlet. The question was where it directed. I want a formal review of my range operations, Maddox said. His voice was tight. I want it documented that outside personnel interfered with this program and that candidates received unauthorized coaching. File the request, Barrett said. I'll note that I was present for the entire qualification sequence this morning and observed no irregularities. Another silence. You were here the whole time? Maddox asked. I had equipment questions for the armorer, Barrett said pleasantly. I arrived just before 0800. I'm sure there are at least a dozen people who can confirm that. Avery turned a page on her clipboard. The range continued its rhythms. Natalie Cruz was back at her position, running the standard sequence with her cohort, her back straight and her hands steady, the particular posture of someone who has just cleared a significant obstacle and is not going to waste the momentum it created by allowing themselves to feel too much about it. Not yet. Later, maybe. But not yet. Avery finished her equipment administration, signed out the delivery documentation, packed the empty cases, and prepared to leave the range area. As she passed Natalie's position, not slowly, not dramatically, just passing, she heard Natalie's voice. Very low, not looking at her, eyes forward on the target. Thank you. Avery kept walking. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. That afternoon, Maddox called her. Not in person, through the official internal communication system, formal notification that her presence was required in the training detachment's administrative office at 1500 hours. The notification included the specific language that meant it was not optional, that her chain of command had been copied, and that the purpose was a formal inquiry into her involvement with training candidates outside the scope of her assigned duties. Avery read the notification at 12:58 and then read it again. He had moved faster than she'd expected. She forwarded the notification to Commander Sloan's office through a separate channel that wasn't in Maddox's visibility, a direct reporting channel that existed, because Sloan had established it when she'd authorized Avery's assignment, for exactly the kind of situation that Sloan had apparently anticipated might eventually arise. She got a response from Sloan's office within 11 minutes. It was 3 words, I'll be there. Avery looked at those 3 words for a moment. She thought about what came next. She thought about 2 years of careful, deliberate invisibility, and what it meant that the invisibility had dissolved in the span of 22 hours. Thought about a rifle in her hands and a target at extreme distance, and the calculations that had arrived without her asking for them, and the sound of steel ringing in the rain. She thought about Natalie Cruz saying thank you with her eyes on the target. She thought about Logan. She thought about what Barrett had said. You're afraid that you're still exactly as good as you ever were. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. At 14:58, she walked into the training detachment's administrative building. At 1500 exactly, Maddox came through the door from the other direction. He saw her and stopped. You brought Commander Sloan, he said. Avery hadn't said anything about Sloan. She hadn't mentioned her at all. But Sloan was sitting at the conference table inside, and the expression on Maddox's face as he processed that fact, the specific recalibration of a man who has walked into a room expecting to be the most powerful person in it, and has discovered that the room contains someone who outranks him, someone who has clearly been briefed, and someone who does not look like this, is a surprise to her at all, was the expression of a man whose carefully constructed situation has just become something different from what he planned. Maddox looked at Avery. His voice was very controlled, very quiet, the compressed anger in its purest form. Tomorrow morning, he said. Full qualification, you. On my range. Under my conceptions, he held her gaze. Then everyone will finally see what you really are. Avery looked at him. She held his gaze for long enough that the silence became its own statement. Then she said quietly, and without any performance, be careful what you ask people to prove. She walked past him into the room. Behind her, she heard his breathing, and she heard, in the particular quality of the silence that followed, the sound of a situation that has passed the point of return. Commander Rebecca Sloan had the kind of stillness that most people spent entire careers failing to develop. She sat at the head of the conference table, with her hands folded, and her expression arranged in the particular neutral that senior officers cultivate when they want to observe a situation fully before allowing the situation to observe them. She had been in the room for 12 minutes before Maddox arrived. She had used those 12 minutes well. Avery sat to Sloane's left. Maddox sat across from both of them and spent the first 30 seconds of the meeting doing the specific recalibration of a man who had prepared extensively for one version of a conversation and is now facing a different version entirely. He had expected Avery, he had not expected Sloane, and Sloane's presence unhurried, unruffled, positioned with the easy authority of someone who had been informed and had decided to be present, rather than summoned, told him something he needed several more seconds to fully process. Whoever Avery Bennett was, she had a direct line to the commanding officer of this detachment that bypassed every normal administrative channel. That was not a line that existed for Armory Logistics personnel. Maddox opened his folder. He was a thorough man, and thoroughness was one of his genuine professional virtues. He had documentation. 3 pages of it. Specific incidents, times, observed behaviors, witness accounts from candidates who had been present on the range Monday morning. He laid it on the table with the controlled precision of someone who has decided that if the meeting is going to happen on terms he didn't choose, at least the evidence will be exactly what he prepared. "I've filed a formal inquiry," he began, "into unauthorized interference with training program operations by assigned support personnel." He looked at Avery. Specifically, unprompted intervention in candidate assessment processes, unauthorized coaching of a course candidate outside of sanctioned training hours, and misrepresentation of professional qualifications during an active training evolution. Sloane looked at the documents. She did not pick them up. "Walk me through the misrepresentation," she said. "Bennett's assigned role is weapons support logistics. Her personnel file, to the extent I've been able to access it, contains no formal marksmanship qualification beyond the standard sidearm requirement for base personnel." He laid the 3rd page on top of the others. "What she demonstrated on my range Monday morning is not consistent with a logistics background. Fired a precision rifle at extreme distance with an unfamiliar platform, under time pressure, and produced a group that most of my certified candidates could not replicate under ideal conditions." He looked at Sloane directly. "That represents either a misrepresentation of her qualifications or a classification situation I wasn't informed about. Either way, the integrity of my program is compromised." Sloane looked at him for a long moment. "Is that everything?" she asked. "I heard the coaching concern. I'm asking if the documentation you've presented represents the full scope of your inquiry." Maddox's jaw worked slightly. "For the formal record." Sloane nodded. She unfolded her hands. She did not look at the documents again. "Senior Chief Maddox," she said, "I am going to tell you one thing, and I'm going to ask you to hear it completely before you respond." She paused, giving the pause the weight it required. "Petty Officer Bennett's pre-assignment record is restricted at a classification level that is above yours, above mine in certain compartments, and above this conversation entirely. I am not going to address the specifics of what is in that record. What I will tell you is that the assignment was authorized, vetted, and appropriate, and that the restriction codes you encountered on her file exist for operational reasons that have nothing to do with this training program, and everything to do with activities that cannot be discussed in this room." Maddox looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not yet, but the specific frustration of a man who has prepared a very effective argument and is now being told that the argument applies to a different situation than the one he's in. "With respect, the coaching inquiry," Sloane said, not unkindly but without any space in it, "is also going to go nowhere. What I'm prepared to document from this meeting is that you raised concerns. Those concerns were heard at the command level, and the command level assessed no violation of program standards." She paused. "What I would ask you to consider, Senior Chief, is whether the energy you've invested in understanding Petty Officer Bennett's background might be more productively directed toward the program review that Master Chief Barrett submitted to my office 3 months ago." The temperature in the room changed. Maddox went very still. It was a different stillness from Sloane's, not controlled, not cultivated, but the involuntary stillness of a man who has just been informed that a situation he believed was contained is considerably less contained than he thought. "I wasn't aware of a program review," he said. "I know," Sloane said. "You weren't meant to be. Not until I had enough information to act on it." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite judgment but occupied the space between them. "You're a technically excellent instructor, Cole. Your marksmanship outcomes are among the best this program has produced. That's real, and it's documented, and it's not what's under review." She let that sit. "What's under review is a pattern of candidate removals that doesn't correlate with technical performance, and a methodology that has been characterized by multiple candidates and one senior observer as systematically punitive in ways that damage rather than develop the people in your program." Silence. Avery had not moved and had not spoken since sitting down. She was watching Maddox the way she watched everything from the outside, with the patient attention of someone who is reading the full text and not just the surface. Maddox looked at her. She saw the moment when it connected for him. Barrett's review. The 3 months of observation. The file that couldn't be accessed. And now Sloane in the room, informed position, not surprised. He had walked in to expose Avery. He had walked into something that had been building around him for months. Meeting, he said slowly, is not about Bennett. This meeting, Sloane said, is about everything that led to this meeting, including Bennett, including Cruz, including the 9 candidates removed from your program in the past 18 months. For reasons that bear re-examination, she stood. I'm not making decisions today. I want you to understand that clearly this is not a disciplinary action. It is a documented conversation that will inform a review process. But I am asking you formally to suspend the evaluation scheduled for tomorrow morning. Maddox's head came up. The evaluation is within my operational authority. It is, Sloane agreed. And I am asking you to suspend it voluntarily. As a demonstration of good faith while the review process is active, she held his gaze. I think you understand the difference between what I'm asking and what I could require. Another silence. Maddox stood. He picked up his documentation from the table. He straightened it with the precise, controlled movements of a man managing himself very carefully. He looked at Avery one more time, and the look was not the contempt of Monday morning or the anger of the past 2 days. It was something more complicated, the look of a man who has begun to understand that he is standing in a larger story than the one he thought he'd entered, and that his position in that story is not the one he would have chosen. I'll consider your request, he said. He left, the door closed behind him. Avery and Sloane sat in the silence for a moment. He's not going to suspend it, Avery said. No, Sloane agreed. He's not. She looked at Avery directly. How are you? The question arrived with the particular weight of someone who is asking it from a position of genuine knowledge, not asking how are you as a formality, but asking how are you as a person who knows what the last 48 hours have cost you and wants a real answer. Avery thought about the honest answer. I don't know yet, she said. Sloane nodded. Barrett told me about your conversation this morning. He called my office at 0600. I know, he's worried about you. He's worried about the program, Avery said. Which is appropriate. The program needs worrying about. He's worried about both. Sloane looked at her steadily. Avery. What happened Monday on that range? Was an equipment problem I noticed and then a demonstration I was pressured into, Avery said. That's what it was. That's what it stays. That's what it is officially, Sloane said. Not asking officially, she paused. 2 years ago I signed an assignment form that put you behind a desk in an armory because you asked me to, and because I believed you needed the time, and because I trusted your judgment about what you could handle. I still trust your judgment. She leaned forward slightly. But I need to know whether what happened Monday is the beginning of something or an isolated incident. Because those two things require different responses from me. Avery looked at the table. She thought about the rifle in her hands. She thought about the calculations arriving whole and ready without her having to build them. She thought about 40 minutes in the pre-dawn range annex with Natalie Cruz and Logan's words coming out of her mouth because they were the right words, and they had always been the right words. She thought about Barrett's voice. You're afraid that you're still exactly as good as you ever were. I don't know yet, she said again. Sloane accepted that. Tomorrow morning, she said, whatever Maddox does. I'll be there. Avery looked up. I know I don't need to. Sloane's voice was calm. I'm going. X did not suspend the evaluation. At 0600, the following morning, his notification went to every instructor and candidate in the advanced course modified qualification sequence. Full attendance required, supplementary exercise. 0800. The language was standard. The intent was transparent to everyone who had been on the range Monday morning. Word reached Avery at 0622 through a text from a number she didn't recognize that contained only the range building designation and the time. She stared at the text for a moment. Then she got up and got dressed. Barrett was waiting outside her building at 0700. He had 2 cups of coffee and he handed her one without preamble, and they walked toward the range in the gray morning with the quiet companionship of 2 people who have said the important things already and are now simply present in what comes next. He built something, Barrett said. Donovan told Martinez and Martinez told me. Variable distances. Moving targets. Unknown configuration until you're behind it. Time pressure throughout. He looked straight ahead. He's designed it to be overwhelming. Too much information. Too fast. For someone who hasn't been in a precision shooting context for 2 years. He doesn't know it's been 2 years. He suspects it's been a while. That's enough for what he's designed. Barrett drank his coffee. He also has the range camera system running. He wants it documented. Avery processed that. He wants footage of me failing, she said. He wants footage of the outcome. Whatever it is, if you fail, he uses it as evidence of misrepresentation. If you don't fail, Barrett paused. He hasn't thought that far. People like Maddox rarely do. They construct situations they're certain they control, and then discover that certainty was the problem. They reached the range building. The crowd was already there. This was the thing that Avery registered first, not the setup. Not Maddox at the far end, not the stations arranged across the range floor. The crowd. Every candidate from the advanced course, and instructors from adjacent programs and base staff who had no official reason to be present but were present anyway, and the specific quality of the gathered attention, not hostile, not entirely friendly but genuinely uncertain, the attention of people who have been told a story and are waiting to find out which version is true. She counted 47 people. She had performed in her operational life under conditions that were objectively more dangerous and vastly more consequential. She had never performed in front of 47 people who were watching specifically to assess her. The two things required different management. She filed that observation away and kept walking. Maddox was standing at the center line. He was in full instructor uniform, posture formal, the performance of professional authority rendered precisely. He watched her cross the range toward him with the contained attention of a man who has been awake since before dawn preparing for this, and is now managing his own anticipation. Bennett. He didn't offer any preamble standard rules. The exercise is assessed by myself and two co-instructors. Results are documented. You'll be informed of the outcome after completion. Understood, Avery said. Any questions before we begin? She looked at the range layout. Took it in the same way she took in everything, not in linear sequence, but all at once. Comprehensive read of the space and the stations and the angles and the distances. Maddox watched her look. No question, she said. Something moved in his expression. He had expected her to look uncertain. What she looked was exactly what she was, someone reading a range. Begin at Station 1, he said. The first 4 stations were precision at fixed distances incrementally longer. Platforms varied between them. No optics on 2 of the rifles. Iron sights only. Maddox had done this deliberately. Iron sight precision at distance required a specific kind of fundamental discipline that people with incomplete training backgrounds typically couldn't replicate at the higher distances. He expected her to hold together through the first 2 and fall apart on the third. She didn't fall apart on the third. She fired clean strings at each station. Not flashy, not demonstrative. She moved through each position with the efficiency of someone for whom the physical process was so deeply grooved that it didn't require conscious construction. She read each platform quickly, adjusted her position to match it, and fired. The hits came back clean. The range cameras captured everyone. Maddox's arms unfolded at the end of Station 3. That was the first tell. Avery caught it in her peripheral vision without looking at him directly. The arms came down from their crossed position, and he put his hands at his sides, and he stood slightly differently, the shift of a man whose first set of predictions has not materialized and who is recalibrating. Station 4 was moving targets. He had set the mover sequence to a pattern that broke rhythm, not the predictable oscillating movement of standard moving target systems, but an irregular sequence designed to defeat the anticipation that most shooters used as a crutch. You could not lead based on where you expected the target to go. You had to track in real time and break the shot in the brief windows when the geometry aligned. It was technically demanding. It was exactly the kind of thing that exposed whether someone had trained against adaptive problems or only against predictable ones. Avery fired the sequence. 4 for 5. One miss on a window that closed faster than the preceding pattern indicated it would a genuine miss. Honest. Not a near hit that got graded harshly. She acknowledged it to herself without reaction and completed the string. Maddox said nothing, but Donovan, standing to Maddox's left, glanced at him, and the glance carried the specific weight of a junior instructor who has been working with a senior instructor long enough to read the micro-expressions, and who has just read one that concerns him. Station 5 was a combined sequence, multiple targets, multiple distances, time window tight enough that the problem became not just marksmanship but decision-making. Which target first, how to sequence the shots to stay inside the window. When to accept a marginal shot and move versus pushing for a clean hit and risking the time. This was the station Maddox had built to break her. Because this station required not just shooting ability but the specific judgment of someone who had made real decisions in real time under real pressure. You couldn't fake your way through it with good fundamentals alone. The decision architecture had to be there. Avery worked Station 5. She sequenced the targets in an order that was not the obvious geometric sequence, not nearest to farthest, which was the standard training approach, but a reading of which targets would drift out of window fastest and which had the longest availability. It was the sequence that someone with operational decision experience would arrive at, and that someone with only training experience would not. She was clean on 4, marginal on 1. A shot she pushed because the window was closing, and a marginal hit inside the window was the correct decision over a clean miss outside it. She finished the sequence 2 seconds inside the time limit. The range was very quiet. Maddox walked to Station 6. He stood there for a moment, with his back to her, looking at the setup. Avery could see his shoulders. She watched them, the way she watched all of a person's body rather than just their face, because shoulders and hands and the set of a spine told truths that faces had learned to manage. His shoulders were tight. He turned around. "Final stage," he said. And his voice was controlled, but something in it was different from the beginning of the morning. The absolute certainty that had been in his voice 40 minutes ago. The certainty of a man who has constructed a situation he controls. That certainty had developed a texture it hadn't had before. Not gone, not even close to gone, but textured. He pointed. One target. The same target he had pointed to Monday morning. The same extreme distance, the same implicit statement. "This is where it ends. This is where we find out." "1 round," he said. "Miss, and your involvement with this program ends formally. In documentation today." Avery looked at the target. He walked to the firing point. She picked up the rifle, and the thing that happened in the next 15 seconds was not something she had planned or prepared for. It arrived the way the shot itself arrived, not through a deliberate construction of its components, but as a complete event. She looked through the optic, and she saw the target at the far end of the range. And she also saw, with the particular interior vision of a person under genuine pressure, not his death, not the radio going silent, not the extraction and the aftermath and the 4 days before the debrief when she had gone through all the motions of existing without managing to actually be present inside any of them. She saw him the way she had known him when he was alive at a firing point, crouched beside her, his voice easy and specific in the way it always was when he was talking about the thing he cared most about. "You know what the difference is," he'd said once. On a training range in a different season of her life. Between a shooter and a sniper, a shooter puts rounds on target. Sniper knows why the round matters. The second you forget the why, you're just a shooter. He'd looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention he gave to things he considered important. The why is what gives you steadiness, not practice, not fundamentals. The why. Avery stood at the firing point with the rifle in her hands and 47 people watching, and Maddox 6 feet behind her, and she stopped trying to suppress Logan's voice and instead she let it in. She thought about why the round mattered. Not the round Maddox wanted her to fire. Not the performance, not the documentation, not the outcome of a range exercise that had been constructed to defeat her. She thought about what the shot actually meant, what it meant that she was standing on this range, in this moment, able to make this calculation. What it meant that she had spent 2 years treating the thing she was most capable of as something to be ashamed of. What it meant that Logan had taught her precision as an act of care, as the specific, disciplined, rigorous care for people who needed someone in an overwatch position to be good enough, patient enough, clear-headed enough to protect them. That was the why. That had always been the why she settled. Not into relaxation. She wasn't relaxed. There was too much at stake for relaxation. She settled into the particular steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and exactly why you're doing it. Calculations arrived without her reaching for them. Wind reading, distance, the fractional adjustment for the temperature differential between the firing point and the target distance. All of it arriving whole. Maddox stepped to her left. He was close enough that she could hear his breathing. "This is where pretending ends," he said. She did not look at him. "It ended Monday morning," she said quietly. "You just weren't paying attention." She fired. The sound traveled the length of the range and the steel dropped. Not swung, not shook. Dropped clean center. The range was absolutely silent for full seconds. Then Maddox's voice, very quiet, arrived from just behind her left shoulder. "Do it again." She looked at him. "The stage is 1 round," she said. Modifying the stage, his voice was tight as wire. "1 more." Donovan stepped forward. "Senior Chief, the protocol, I'm modifying the stage." He didn't look at Donovan. He kept his eyes on Avery. Unless she's not confident, she can repeat it. Avery looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was doing. 1 shot could be luck. 2 identical shots, back to back at extreme distance, that was something else. He was trying to catch a repeat performance, to make the case that the first shot had been fortunate. To create the documentation he needed, she worked the bolt. She settled behind the optic. She found the target. She fired. The steel dropped again. Same spot. The silence this time was a different quality from any of the previous silences. It was the silence of a room, or in this case, a range in which something has shifted beyond the point of argument. Not beyond the point of discussion, not beyond the point of processing, but beyond the point where anyone could reasonably claim they hadn't seen what they'd seen. 47 people had seen it. The range cameras had captured it. Donovan was very still. The candidates had stopped all pretense of their secondary activities and were simply watching. Smirked stood at the rear of the line with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in the expression he wore when he was being very careful about what he allowed to show. Maddox stood 6 feet from Avery and breathed. And then, from the entrance to the range building, a voice said, "That's enough." Commander Rebecca Sloan walked onto the range. She was in her service uniform, which at 0840 in the morning, on a range exercise that had not been formally scheduled, meant she had dressed for this specifically. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is now executing it and is not going to be in a hurry about it, because hurrying would suggest uncertainty, and she was not uncertain. She stopped at the center line. "Senior Chief Maddox," she said, "end the exercise." He turned to face her. And the thing that crossed his face in that moment, the complicated, layered expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered on his own ground by people he underestimated, was something Avery had not expected to feel anything about. He had expected satisfaction or vindication, or at minimum the neutral satisfaction of a situation resolving as it logically should. Felt none of those things. What she felt was something closer to exhaustion, and something closer to grief, and something that she couldn't fully name. Maddox said. His voice was controlled. "Barely. This is a sanctioned range exercise within my operational authority," it was Sloan said. Over now, she looked at him with the direct, unadorned attention that senior officers develop when they have decided to stop managing a situation and start resolving it. "I'm going to ask you to send your candidates and instructors back to their primary assignments. Then I'm going to ask you and Master Chief Barrett to join me in the administrative building." Maddox looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Avery. He looked at the range, at the cameras. At 47 people who had watched everything, he turned to his candidates. "Dismissed," he said. "Return to your primary assignments." They dispersed. Not quickly, not eagerly, with the reluctant, backward-glancing departure of people who have been present at something significant, and are not entirely ready to stop being present at it. The instructors followed. Donovan lingered for a moment at the edge of the firing area, looking at Maddox with the specific expression of a loyal subordinate who has begun to understand that loyalty to this particular person may require renegotiation. Then he left too. The range emptied to 4 people. Avery. Maddox at Sloan. Maddox looked at Sloan. "What happens now?" Now Sloan said, "I tell you what I should have told you 3 months ago, when Barrett's review first crossed my desk and I decided to wait for more information." She clasped her hands behind her back. Petty Officer Bennett was not assigned to this base in a support capacity, because that is the appropriate use of her abilities. She was assigned here because she requested a specific period of operational distance following a classified mission incident, and that request was granted because it was legitimate and because people who have been through what she has been through have earned the right to step back. She looked at Maddox. "Her qualifications exceed yours. Her operational record exceeds anything in this building. And the file you've been trying to access for 3 days would make you understand, if you could read it, that the question of whether Avery Bennett is qualified to have an opinion on your range is not a question with a meaningful answer, because qualified is a word that applies to people who are still on their way up, and she's a long way past up." Maddox absorbed this, every word of it. Avery watched him process it and waited for the anger, because anger was the expected response and anger would be manageable. What she wasn't prepared for was what actually crossed his face, something more complicated and more human than anger. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the beginning of a man who has just been shown a version of reality that requires significant revision of the version he's been living in. He looked at her. You stood here and let me." "Yes," Avery said. Why? She looked at him directly. She thought about the answer carefully, because the answer was real and she wasn't going to waste it. "Because I wanted to know," she said, "whether you respected people before you knew what they could do to you." Silence. "Stood with that?" "And," he asked. His voice was different. Something had gone out of it, not the strength, the armor. "You already know the answer," Avery said. He looked away. "It looky." At the target at the far end, steel that had dropped twice under clean center hits from a rifle handled by a woman he had tried to publicly humiliate. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked past Avery, toward the entrance to the range building, toward the armorers, and the cooks, and the mechanics, and the maintenance crews who had filtered to the edges of the area during the exercise and who were still there, watching. The people who kept the base functional, and who were invisible to Maddox in exactly the same way Avery had been invisible present, essential beneath his threshold of attention until the moment they became useful to him. Avery looked at them too. Then she looked back at Maddox. "If learning what I used to be suddenly makes me worthy of your respect," she said, "then you still haven't understood anything." The words sat in the air between them. Barrett looked at the floor. Sloane looked at nothing in particular. Stood very still. Then Sloane spoke. "Senior Chief Maddox." Her voice was professional, steady, the voice of institutional authority, doing what institutional authority is designed to do when the informal approaches have run their course. "Effective immediately. You are suspended from instructional duties, pending formal review of the candidate removal patterns identified in Master Chief Barrett's report. This is not punitive, it is procedural. You will have full opportunity to present your perspective during the review process." She paused. "The review will be conducted by Barrett and 2 external instructors from Naval Special Warfare Command. It will address the last 18 months of program operations. The outcome will determine whether and in what capacity you return to instructional duty." Maddox's jaw tightened. He nodded once. Once the nod of a man who has been stripped of the thing he's built his professional identity around, and is processing the scale of that loss in real time. He looked at Barrett. "You've been building this for 3 months. "I've been watching for longer than that," Barrett said. His voice was quiet and without cruelty. "I didn't want to be right. You should know that." "I wasn't wrong." Cole. "And you know," the other silence. Maddox walked past all 3 of them toward the exit. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. "Bennett." His voice was flatter than it had been all morning. Flatter than it had been all week. The flatness of something that had been compressed and had finally, at extraordinary pressure, changed state entirely. "Yes," Avery said. "How many?" he asked. "In the field." How many times did it actually matter? She understood the question. It wasn't about statistics. It wasn't about documentation or cleared records or anything that could be filed. Neat. It was the question of a man who has just been told that the person he dismissed was the kind of person whose work determined whether other people came home, and who is only now beginning to feel the full weight of what that means. He thought about the honest answer. "Enough," she said. "Enough that I stopped counting." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he walked out. The range was quiet. Barrett exhaled slowly. Sloane looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at Avery. The kind of look that supervisors have for the people under their command who have just gone through something that cannot be fully captured in any documentation that will follow. "Are you all right?" Sloane asked. "No," Avery said. Then, after a moment, "Yes, I don't know both." Barrett almost smiled. "That's the most honest answer I've heard all week." Sloane's phone rang. She answered it. Her expression changed within the first 2 seconds of the call, not dramatically. Not in a way that would register to someone who didn't know how to read faces. But Avery knew how to read faces, and she read this one. Operational. Something operational. Her whole body responded before her mind had finished processing the specific cellular alertness of someone whose nervous system has been trained to a particular register and has just heard the frequency it was trained to recognize. She watched Sloane. Sloane listened, nodded once, said understood and how long and what assets are currently available. Then she lowered the phone and looked at Avery with an expression that carried several things simultaneously: apology, necessity, and the particular directness of a senior officer who is about to ask something significant and is not going to dress it up. "Their situation," Sloane said. "Maritime. Off the Virginia coast." She paused. "I need to talk to you." Barrett looked at Avery. Avery felt the weight of the morning pressing against the weight of what Sloane's expression was telling her, felt the particular gravitational pull of a life she had spent 2 years walking away from exerting its force one more time, felt Logan's voice in her head with the specific clarity it always had when something real was about to happen. "Don't shoot for the man you lost." She looked at Sloane. "Tell me," she said. And everything that she had spent 2 years trying to put away shifted in her chest, not disappearing, not resolving, but rearranging itself into something she could carry differently than she'd been carrying it, something that might, if she let it, become not a weight but a direction. Sloane began to speak, and Avery Bennett, who had told herself she was finished, stood on a rain-soaked range at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek and listened to what came next. Sloane's briefing took 11 minutes. She delivered it standing in the center of the empty range, her phone producing a secure document that she held flat so Avery and Barrett could read alongside her, her voice precise and stripped of everything except the facts. The research vessel was called the Meridian. It had departed Norfolk 3 days ago on a contracted oceanographic survey with a crew of 9 civilians and 2 passengers, one of whom was Dr. Claire Donovan, an intelligence liaison attached to a joint Navy civilian research program, whose specific purpose was classified above the scope of the current conversation. The Meridian had stopped transmitting at 03:14. A Coast Guard response vessel had located it at 05:40, approximately 31 nautical miles off the Virginia coast. The vessel was under control of an unknown number of armed individuals. Current intelligence assessed 2, possibly 3 and 9 people aboard were being held. The rescue team was already moving. A maritime assault element from Dam Neck had been activated 40 minutes ago. They could reach the vessel. They had the personnel and the equipment and the tactical expertise to execute a rescue operation. What they did not have, Sloan said, was a precision shooter. Their assigned sniper had been evacuated to Portsmouth Naval Medical Center the previous evening with a burst appendix. His backup was on authorized leave in San Diego and was currently on a flight that would land in 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 90 minutes too late, because the assault element's operational window closed at 1100 hours before the weather system moving up the coast made the approach non-viable. Avery had listened to all of this without speaking. When Sloan finished, the range was quiet. "Who else?" Avery asked. "I've made 4 calls," Sloan said. 2 people are geographically unavailable within the window. 1 is medically non-deployable. The 4th, Reyes, you know him from the Mediterranean, is in a classified status that makes his deployment to this operation a legal problem I can't solve in 90 minutes. Qualified shooters don't disappear, Avery said. There are people in this building, not at the level this situation requires, Sloan said quietly. A moving vessel, maritime conditions, hostages in proximity to the threat. Avery, I've run the asset list. Twice, you are the correct answer. I would not be standing here if you weren't. Avery looked at the range floor. She was aware of Barrett beside her, his breathing slow and steady, not pushing, not pulling, just present. She was aware of Sloan watching her, with the careful attention of someone who is making a request they have every right to make, but whose professional responsibility requires them to make it honestly rather than coercively. She was aware of Logan Pierce's absence in the room, which was its own kind of presence. I haven't been operational in 22 months, she said. I know the last time I was in a live-fire situation with a hostage in proximity. I know, Sloan said again. Voice was steady, not impatient, not dismissive. Steady, in the way of someone who is holding the full weight of what they're asking. I know what the last time cost you. I know why you're here instead of somewhere else. I know all of it. She paused, and I'm still asking. The silence stretched. Barrett spoke. I'll go as your observer, he said. Avery looked at him. I know maritime conditions. I've done overwatch support in 6 different ocean environments. I can call wind off water, read vessel movement, manage the communication link between you and the assault element. He said it matter-of-factly. The way he said everything as if the information were simply available, and he was making it available. You won't be alone at the position. Avery looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what alone meant. She had been alone at the position the last time. Technically, Logan had been her spotter, which made them a pair, which was as alone as you got in that line of work, because the pair was the complete unit and there was no one else, and when the pair broke, it broke completely. The idea of being at a position with Barrett, with someone who understood the problem, who had his own version of the history, who had sat with her in a pre-dawn parking lot and said things that were true instead of things that were convenient, that was not the same as being alone. It was not the same as having Logan, but it was not the same as being alone. What's the vessel layout, she asked. Sloane's expression shifted not to relief, not yet, but to the particular focus of a person who has asked a critical question and gotten an answer that means the work can begin. She pulled up the second document on her phone. The briefing that followed was fast and thorough and conducted on a moving vehicle because they didn't have the luxury of a fixed briefing room. Navy transport had been arranged and was waiting. And Sloan went through the vessel schematics and the intelligence assessment and the assault element's planned approach, while Avery and Barrett sat across from her and the vehicle moved through the base toward the waterfront. Meridian was a research vessel, not a warship. Its layout was built for ocean science, not defensive positioning, which meant the interior spaces were open and the exterior deck positions were limited, and the threat had positioned itself in the one location that was hardest to access from below and most exposed from elevation. The bridge section had a narrow exposed walkaround on 3 sides. Primary threat, the individual controlling the hostages directly, was using the forward section of that walk-around as their position, which kept them in sightline of the hostages and in view of any approaching vessel, which was tactically intelligent. It also, Avery noted, put them in a position that was accessible from elevation at a specific angle from the vessel's port forward quarter, from a support vessel or a helicopter at the correct position. "What's the assault team's approach vector?" she asked. "Starboard aft," Sloan said. "They come up the stern ladder while the threat's attention is on the port side. The problem is the hostages are on the bridge visible from the forward walk-around position. If the threat hears the assault team before they're secure, they move to the bridge. That's where people die. So the shot has to come before the assault team is audible. The shot has to come at a specific window the assault team commander identifies through comms. They'll tell you when they're positioned. You have approximately 4 to 8 seconds after that call, before the timing window collapses. 4 to 8 seconds. Avery ran the calculation. What's the sea state? 2 to 3 feet. Wind southeast at 12 knots, gusting to 18. Platform stability, support vessel. 32-footer. We can get you stationary but not perfectly stable. You're going to have vessel movement to account for on top of the target movement. How far? Intelligence puts the optimal position at approximately 280 meters. It opened to 310 depending on approach geometry. Avery was quiet for a moment. Barrett looked at her. He didn't say anything, he just looked. "To hostages," Avery said. "Where are they relative to the target?" Sloan showed her the diagram. Avery studied it. The hostages were on the bridge interior, separated from the forward walk-around by the bridge windows and the exterior bulkhead. The threat on the walk-around had visual access to them through those windows. It was a surveillance position, not a direct proximity position. The threat was watching the hostages, but was not physically adjacent to them. It changed the geometry. Not necessarily to her advantage. The window created by that geometry was narrow and would require the threat to be in a specific position at the specific moment. But it was a window. "There's a civilian movement problem," she said. Sloan nodded. "Our intelligence shows crew members on the bridge deck who are not currently restrained. They're allowed limited movement, probably to create the appearance of normalcy for any vessel that approaches. They move unpredictably, which means the window could close with no warning. Sloan confirmed. The vehicle stopped. They were at the waterfront. The support vessel was there. The assault element had already departed 20 minutes earlier to pre-position. Avery and Barrett would approach from a separate vector and establish the overwatch position while the assault team got into their final approach. Barrett was already moving, efficiently and without wasted motion, checking his equipment. He had the observer key, rangefinders, wind instruments, communication set. He moved through the check with the unconscious fluency of someone for whom this was deeply habitual, and watching him do it made something inside Avery's chest settle slightly. Not all the way, but slightly. She took the rifle case from Sloan. She opened it. The rifle inside was not the training platform she'd handled Monday morning, not the unfamiliar configuration Maddox had handed her to create disadvantage. It was a precision platform she recognized, had trained with, had used operationally, had last held 17 months ago in a sealed evidence room during a debrief where she'd had to account for every round she'd fired and explain every decision she'd made, and had given honest answers to all of it, and had still walked out of that room carrying something that honest answers couldn't resolve. She closed the case. Sloan's voice was quiet. They were standing near the water and the wind off the bay was cold, and the morning had moved past 9 o'clock into the specifically of mid-morning light. That meant the operational window was moving faster than the conversation was. "I'm ready," Avery said. "That's not what I was going to say." Avery looked at her. "I was going to say." Sloan paused, choosing the words with the care of someone who has very few words available and needs each one to land correctly. "Whatever happens out there, whatever you decide in the moment, with the shot or without it, that decision is yours. I am not sending you out there to do something you've decided you won't do. I'm sending you out there because you're the person most qualified to make the decision when you're in the position. Those are different things." Avery held her gaze. "I know," she said. "Good." Sloan stepped back. "Come back." Barrett appeared at Avery's shoulder. "We're on." They got on the boat. The water was gray-green and cold, and the support vessel moved through it with the purposeful efficiency of a platform that had been chosen for exactly this kind of transit, fast enough to be useful, stable enough to be workable. Avery sat in the forward section with the rifle case between her knees and felt the vessel's motion through her legs, and was already running the adjustments how the movement would translate to the shot, how the timing would need to account for the vessel's pitch cycle, where in that cycle the most stable window existed. It was a calculation she had made before in different water, in different conditions, with Logan beside her, running the same calculation simultaneously so they could cross-check. Barrett sat across from her. He had the observer kit open on the seat beside him and he was reviewing the comm setup, his hands moving through the equipment check with quiet competence. "Tell me about Reyes," he said without looking up. "Marcus Reyes. We came up together. He and Logan were close." Avery looked at the water. "He's the one who called me the day after the debrief. Didn't say anything. Just called and stayed on the line for 20 minutes without speaking. I understood what he was saying." "You kept in touch?" "Christmas. His daughter's birthday. The anniversaries of things we don't name." She paused. "He's the one who told me that Logan wouldn't have wanted me to disappear. I told him he was wrong." She looked at Barrett. "I was wrong." Barrett absorbed that. 280 meters, sea state 2 to 3, he said. "In these conditions, you're going to want to let me call the release point. Your hands are going to be on the rifle. You can't read the pitch cycle and manage the shot simultaneously. Call it to me when you're ready, and I'll give you the window." "I know the drill. I know you know. I'm telling you how I work, so we're not improvising." He looked at her. "This is the part where working with someone new is hardest. We don't have Logan's shorthand. We're going to have to build it fast and rough and trust it." He held her gaze. "I trust what I've seen from you. You need to trust what you've seen from me." She thought about 3 months of observation. Barrett watching Maddox with the patient, thorough attention of a man building a case on principle, not on expedience. Barrett in the pre-dawn parking lot saying the things that were true when it would have been considerably easier to say things that were comfortable. "I trust it," she said. The comm crackled. The assault element commander's voice came through, clipped and professional, establishing that they were in position at the stern approach. The tactical picture was what intelligence had assessed: 1 confirmed threat on the forward walkaround, 1 additional threat below decks, 9 civilians with freedom of limited movement on the bridge deck. One thing intelligence didn't have, the assault element commander said. "The walkaround threat has moved twice in the last 15 minutes. He's not static. He's patrolling the forward section." Avery and Barrett looked at each other. A patrolling threat complicated the shot geometry in ways that a static target did not. The window was no longer predictable. It would arrive when it arrived, and it would be briefer than what a static target provided. And the brief window would arrive inside a larger movement pattern that she couldn't fully anticipate from her position. "Understood," Avery said into the comm. "What's the patrol interval?" "Approximately 4 minutes. He goes to the port forward corner, stands for 30 to 60 seconds, returns to the center line. Corner position is my window. Corner position is your best geometry for a clean shot without hostage proximity risk. Center line is closer to the bridge windows. 4 minutes. 30 to 60 second window. Maritime conditions. Vessel movement. 280 meters. Understood," she said again. "I'll tell you when I'm set. You hold until I call clear. Do not begin your approach until I call clear." "Copy that." She put the comm down. Barrett was already reading the wind with the handheld instrument. Southeast 14. Gusting out of cycle. There's an irregular pattern in the gusts. About every 90 seconds. You want to fire in the trough between gusts, not during. Show me the cycle. He held up the instrument and she watched the readings for 2 minutes, letting the pattern establish itself in her awareness, not memorizing it, consciously building the feel of it. The way Logan had taught her to read environmental conditions, not as data points, as rhythm. The environment has a rhythm. You find the rhythm, you fit your shot into the rhythm. Support vessel reached position and cut its engines to hold station. The motion changed active transit to passive drift management. More unpredictable, more demanding. Avery opened the rifle case. He assembled the platform in silence. Barrett watched her hands move through the process and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The hands knew the process. She checked the optic adjustment, and the zero and the magazine seating, and then she moved to the forward deck and got into position. The cold was more immediate here. The water smell, salt and depth, and the specific quality of open ocean air that she had breathed in a dozen operational environments across her career. Her body registered it not as discomfort but as familiar, as context, as the specific kind of environment in which certain things happened and for which certain preparations were appropriate. She looked through the optic. The meridian was visible. She found the bridge structure, the walk-around, the forward section. She located the threat, a figure in dark clothing moving in the patrol pattern the assault element had described. She watched the pattern, counted the interval, tracked the position at the corner. "I have the target," she said. "Copy," Barrett said from behind and above her, where his position gave him the observer angle. Patrol interval is approximately 340 to 410. Corner dwell is 40 to 60 seconds. He's not completely regular, I see it. Ranging the corner position 278 meters. 278. Slightly closer than intelligence assessed. She adjusted. Wind. Last gust 90 seconds ago. Next one due, she waited. The gust came. The vessel shifted slightly in response. He rode the movement, not fighting it, not ignoring it. Absorbing it. Trough now, Barrett said. 8 to 10 seconds. She was not on the target in the corner. The threat was still at center line. Passing, she said. Copy. They waited through the next patrol cycle. She tracked Barrett, called wind. The assault element held at the stern. Patient, waiting for her signal. The threat moved to the corner. Target is at position, Barrett said. Wind 6. Trough in, and then a civilian came out of the bridge interior onto the walk-around. Not through the door that the threat used. Through the secondary access, a maintenance hatch that apparently the intelligence assessment hadn't captured because it was partially obstructed on the satellite imagery. Civilian female, small, moving with the tentative body language of someone who has been confined and is taking a controlled risk to get air, stepped out onto the walk-around and stopped. Between Avery and the threat. I see it, Barrett said. Civilian in the line. The assault element clicked. What's the status? Hold, Avery said again. We have a civilian obstruction. Not firing. Silence on the comm, then copy. We're holding. Window closes in 7 minutes before the approach becomes compromised. 7 minutes. Avery did not move. She watched through the optic. The civilian, she could see now that it was a young woman. Crew member, dark jacket. Standing against the exterior rail and looking out at the water with her back partially to the threat. The threat had seen her. He had not reacted with alarm, which meant the movement wasn't unusual. She'd done this before. Probably. And had been allowed to. The threat looked at the civilian. Then he looked out at the water. Then back toward the bridge interior. He was distracted. Command came through the comm. Bennett? What's your timeline? I don't have one, Avery said. Her voice was level. I'm waiting for a clean window. We have 6 minutes before the weather becomes a factor, I understand. I'm not firing with a civilian in the line. Brief silence. There are 9 lives on that vessel. There are 9 lives and one more who's currently standing in my shot, Avery said. I won't fire. Barrett's hand touched her shoulder blade. Not pressure, just contact. Present, she watched the civilian at the rail. Come on, she thought. Just go back inside. The civilian didn't move. 5 minutes. The threat completed his dwell time at the corner and began moving back toward center line. Window closed. Threat is moving off position, Barrett said quietly. I see it. 4 minutes. The civilian stayed at the rail. She had her face lifted to the wind, and from this distance, through the optic, Avery could see the quality of it, the specific posture of someone who has been in constraining situation and is stealing a moment of sky and air and open horizon. She understood that posture intimately. She did not rush the woman with the force of her will. She did not curse the timing or the intelligence gap or the irregular maintenance hatch that hadn't shown on the satellite imagery. She watched and she waited and she stayed in the position, and she did not allow the time pressure to become panic, because panic was the enemy of the only thing she could control, which was her own stillness. The threat reached center line, paused, looked at the civilian, said something that didn't carry to Avery's position. The civilian turned slightly, and then, for a reason that had nothing to do with any tactical calculation and everything to do with the random, uncontrollable movement of human beings in real situations, she stepped back toward the maintenance hatch. Civilian is moving, Barrett said. His voice was controlled, but she heard it, the specific quality of a held breath. Civilian went back inside. The hatch closed. 3 minutes, Barrett said. Threat is approaching corner position. Wind southeast 11. Trough in 20 seconds. Avery found the threat in the optic. He was moving toward the corner with the unhurried authority of a man who believes he is in control of his environment. He reached the corner. He stopped. Target at position, Barrett said. Wind 6. Trough now. She was already there. The vessel was in the bottom of its pitch cycle. The threat was at the corner. The civilians were inside. Everything aligned in the single moment that everything aligns, the moment that cannot be manufactured or forced or hurried into existence, but can only be recognized when it arrives and met with the full, focused, prepared attention of someone who has spent years learning how to be ready for it. She fired. The sound of the shot traveled out across the water. Barrett's voice, immediate and clean, hit. Threat is down then. Go, 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 her voice into the comm. Assault team. Now the assault element moved. She stayed in position. She tracked the secondary threat below decks according to intelligence. She watched the access points, watched the assault team clear the stern approach. Watched them move through the vessel with the fast, coordinated efficiency of people who had trained for this and were now executing it without the particular complication that she had just removed. 40 seconds. Barrett's hand on her shoulder again. Steady pressure this time. Assault team reports interior secure, the comm said. One additional threat surrendered without resistance. All 9 civilians confirmed safe. Dr. Donovan is uninjured. Avery lowered the rifle. She stayed in the prone position for a moment and breathed. Barrett crouched beside her, not touching her now. Just beside her, the way he'd been present throughout the morning, available, steady, not requiring anything from her in the immediate aftermath that she hadn't already given. "You okay?" he asked. She thought about the question. She thought about the civilian at the rail, the young woman with her face turned to the wind, feeling a moment of open sky. She thought about the way she had waited. She thought about the moment when she could have been pressured into a shot that wasn't clear and had refused to take it. Thought about Logan. Don't shoot for the man you lost. Shoot for the people who still have something to lose. She thought about precision, about what the word actually meant, beyond the technical definition, beyond the training context, beyond everything that Maddox had turned it into by making it a tool of competition and humiliation. Precision was not the ability to put a round into a tight group under test conditions. Precision was the discipline to know when the conditions for the shot existed and when they didn't. Precision was the willingness to wait, to refuse, to hold the line between action and inaction with the full force of everything you'd trained for, and not collapse that line because someone was counting seconds in your ear. Precision was not what you did when you fired. It was what you chose when you didn't. Logan had tried to tell her that years ago. She had thought she understood it. She understood it now in a way that was fundamentally different, understood it with her body and her breath, and the 47 seconds she had just spent watching a civilian at a rail and choosing not to take the shot that would have ended the situation faster but would have risked the wrong thing.
"Yeah," she said.
She stood. Barrett stood with her. The support vessel began its return transit, the engine coming up from idle to transit speed, and Avery stood at the forward deck with the wind off the water in her face and the rifle case secured, and Dr. Claire Donovan alive on a research vessel 30 miles off the Virginia coast, and she thought about what she had understood and what it meant for what came next. Barrett appeared beside her. He stood with his hands on the forward rail and looked out at the water and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said Logan would have liked that shot. Avery looked at the water. "He would have called it before I did," she said, "probably." Barrett paused. "But you made it." She was quiet for a moment. "He taught me how," she said. "I just finally understood what he was teaching." They stood there as the vessel moved through the gray-green water back toward the Virginia coast, and the wind was cold and salt-sharp, and the sky above them was the specific gray of a day that has held weather and is slowly beginning to release it, the clouds thinning at their edges where the system was breaking. Behind them, the meridian grew smaller as the distance increased. Avery watched it until it was too small to distinguish from the horizon. She thought about 22 months of careful, deliberate distance from the thing she was. She thought about the scope mount on a training rifle and a young woman with deteriorating confidence and a man who had placed a rifle in her hands to humiliate her and had instead opened a door she'd spent 2 years locking. She thought about 3 shots on a range in the rain and what had started with them. She thought about standing at this position in these maritime conditions and waiting through the hardest 47 seconds she had experienced in 2 years, and what that waiting had required and what it proved. Not that she could still shoot. She had known that. Maddox's range had confirmed it if she'd needed confirmation. What it proved was that she could still choose, that she could carry everything Logan had taught her, every conversation, every correction, every honest and difficult truth he'd delivered with the patient directness of someone who cared more about making you better than about making you comfortable, and apply it in the moment where it mattered, under the conditions where it mattered, for the reasons that actually mattered. She had spent 2 years associating the rifle with loss, with the specific, irreversible, unfixable loss of someone who could not be replaced, and whose death she had survived and never quite forgiven herself for surviving. She understood now that she had been carrying Logan's absence when she should have been carrying his presence. Not the fact of his death, but the fact of his life, what he'd taught her, how he'd seen the work, what he'd believed about why precision mattered and who it was for, and what it meant to be someone that other people could depend on when everything else had gone wrong. She had been spending 2 years trying to honor him by disappearing. She understood now that honoring him meant staying. The Virginia coastline appeared on the horizon. Barrett's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Sloan, he said. He held it out. Met. Donovan is safe, Sloan said immediately. The operation is being logged as a training incident at this stage. Pending full after-action review, your involvement will be documented at the classification level appropriate to your sealed record. A pause. Are you all right? Yes, Avery said. Barrett. He's good. Come to my office when you're back. Another pause. Avery. Yes, I want to talk to you about something. When you're ready. No pressure on timeline. Sloan's voice shifted not much, but enough. The shift of a commanding officer stepping fractionally out of the commanding officer register and speaking as something else, something more personal. There's a position, not operational. Instructional. The advanced sniper curriculum has been without leadership for 3 months because the person who should have been running it was running it wrong. She paused. I think you know what I'm going to say. Avery looked at the coastline growing larger. She thought about a pre-dawn range annex. She thought about Logan's words coming out of her mouth and landing correctly because they were the right words and they had always been the right words. She thought about Natalie Cruz saying thank you with her eyes on a target. I have conditions, Avery said. Brief silence then, and she could hear the specific quality of it. Sloan wasn't surprised. Sloan had known there would be conditions. Sloan had possibly been counting on there being conditions. Tell me your conditions, Sloan said. When I'm back, Avery said. I'll tell you in person. She handed the phone back to Barrett. He looked at her. Instructional, he said, apparently. Is that something you want? She thought about it honestly. The way she'd been trying to think about things for the past 72 hours without the protective layer of deflection, without the practice distance she'd spent 22 months cultivating. She thought about what it would mean to stand at the front of a room and teach. Not demonstrate, not perform. Teach the specific, patient, consequential work of transferring what you understood to people who needed to understand it, in ways that would stay with them after you were no longer in the room. She thought about Logan. Yes, she said. The word arrived without hesitation, which surprised her, and then surprised her less when she thought about where it came from. Barrett nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had just watched something he'd been hoping for become something that was actually going to happen. He would have been glad, he said. Avery didn't answer. He didn't need to. The vessel reached the dock. She picked up the rifle case and stepped off the boat and felt the sasada ground under her feet after the vessel's motion, and the solidity of it was different from how it had felt when she'd stepped onto the dock this morning. Reams ground, the same dock, the same gray Virginia morning. Different weight to it, the kind of weight that wasn't burden but anchor. She walked up the dock toward the base, and Barrett walked beside her. And neither of them said anything for a while, because the silence was the right kind, the kind that follows something real and doesn't need to be filled. Behind her the water moved. Logan Pierce had taught her that precision was not the ability to pull a trigger. It was the discipline to wait until doing so protected the right person. She had waited. She had protected the right people. She was still here. And for the first time in 22 months, that fact did not feel like a wound. It felt like a place to begin. She was still carrying the rifle case when she walked into Sloan's office. She didn't set it down immediately. She held it for a moment, standing just inside the door, aware of the weight of it, in a way that was different from this morning, different from yesterday, different from the 2 years before that. It was the same weight, the same physical fact of metal and polymer and glass, but the meaning she'd been carrying alongside it had shifted somewhere between the dock and this office, somewhere in the cold walk up from the waterfront with Barrett's beside her, and Logan's voice finally quiet. It got quiet when something had been understood rather than suppressed. She set it down against the wall. Sloan looked up from her desk. She looked at Avery's face for a moment, with the careful attention of someone reading not a report but a person, and whatever she read there made her sit back in her chair and exhale slowly through her nose, the exhale of someone who has been holding a particular form of tension for several hours and has just been given permission to release it. Sit down, she said. Avery sat. Barrett came in behind her and took the chair to her left without being invited, which was the kind of thing that Barrett did, and that Sloan had apparently long since decided to accommodate, because he didn't do it frivolously. Donovan is being transported to Portsmouth for medical evaluation, Sloan said. Precautionary. She's uninjured, but she's been on that vessel for 6 hours in a high-stress situation, and protocol requires the evaluation. She folded her hands on her desk. The after-action is going to take several days to fully document. For the moment, the operational aspects of this morning are sealed at the appropriate classification. What is not sealed, what will be documented and is already circulating through the base, is that a maritime rescue operation occurred, that it was successful, and that it was supported by base personnel. She looked at Avery. Your name will not appear in any public documentation. But people who were on that range this morning know who was on that boat. I understand, Avery said. Does that bother you? Avery thought about it honestly. Not the way it would have yesterday. Sloane absorbed that. You said you had conditions, she said. Yes, tell me. Avery had been organizing her conditions since the boat. Not as a list, she didn't think in lists, had never thought in lists. It was one of the things that made her useful in environments where lists became obsolete the moment they were written. She thought in relationships, in the way things connected to other things and what those connections produced. She had been running the connections since the waterfront, and by the time she walked into Sloane's office, the architecture was clear. The curriculum doesn't start with marksmanship, she said. Sloane waited. The existing curriculum, Maddox's curriculum, opens with technical fundamentals and runs candidates through qualification progressions as the primary assessment framework. The assumption is that marksmanship competence is the entry point, and everything else develops from there. Avery paused. That assumption produces technically capable people who sometimes do catastrophically wrong things with their technical capability. Because they've been taught to shoot, before they've been taught to think about why shooting is the last resort, rather than the first instrument. You want to restructure the curriculum sequence. I want to restructure the curriculum foundation. The sequence is a symptom. The foundation is the problem. She looked at Sloane directly. Candidates in this program should be spending the first segment of their training not behind a rifle but in scenarios that require them to exercise judgment under pressure. Restraint under pressure. The decision not to fire is harder than the decision to fire, and it is more consequential in operational environments. And we do not train for it. We assume it. We assume that competent people will naturally arrive at the correct decision about when not to use the capability we've given them. She paused. Logan Pierce understood that. He taught me that. It took me 2 years and this morning to understand what he was actually teaching. Barrett hadn't spoken since sitting down. He was listening with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he considered important, and Avery could feel it not as pressure but as support. The weight of someone who has been thinking the same things and is waiting to hear them said aloud by the right person. Sloane was quiet for a moment.
The NW liaison is going to push back on that, she said.
Restructuring the foundational sequence requires program authorization from above this detachment. I know, I'll need to build a case for it. I'll help you build it. It'll take months. The bureaucratic process, I'm not in a hurry, Avery said. Spent 2 years moving too slow. I can survive a few months of paperwork. Something moved in Sloane's expression. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. The second condition, Avery said. There's a second. Candidate assessments for removal from the program require co-signature from 2 instructors and documented evidence reviewed by the detachment commander. No single instructor makes a unilateral removal decision, she paused. What Maddox did to those 9 candidates and probably more before Barrett started counting cannot happen again, because one person has unchecked authority over someone else's entire professional future. Sloane nodded slowly. That's a policy change. Also requires authorization above this level. Add it to the case. Sloane looked at her for a long moment. Third condition, Avery said. Of course there's a third. Barrett co-leads the program. Barrett looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. You've been watching this Procrastance deteriorate for 3 months and building documentation and filing reviews and doing the careful, patient work of someone who understands that institutions only change when you give them the evidence they need to justify change. You understand the administrative structure, the candidate population, the political landscape of this detachment, and you understand marksmanship at the level required. She paused. Know the operational side, you know the institutional side. Program needs both. Barrett was quiet for a long moment. I'm 8 months from retirement, he said. I know. That's not a lot of runway for building something new. 8 months is enough to build a foundation, Avery said. I can hold the structure after that, but I need someone who knows this place from the inside while I'm still learning it from my new angle. She held his gaze. And I need someone who's going to tell me when I'm wrong. Not someone who's going to defer to my operational history when the situation requires honesty. Someone who's actually going to tell me. Barrett looked at the floor. He looked at Sloane. He looked back at Avery. You're a difficult person to say no to, he said. I learned from someone who was impossible to say no to, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. All right, he said. Sloane straightened in her chair. I'll begin drafting the authorization request today. The co-signature policy is the fastest I can implement that as an interim measure under my existing detachment authority. While the formal process runs, she looked at Avery. The curriculum restructure is the long fight. I want you to understand that it might not look like what you've described when it comes out the other side of the authorization process. I understand bureaucratic attrition, Avery said. Good, because it's going to try to attrit this. Sloan paused. One more thing. The Maddox review. The name arrived in the room with the weight it had accumulated over the past 3 days. Not the name of an adversary exactly. Avery had moved past the frame of adversary, an adversary's defeat, somewhere during the 47 seconds on the water when she had been too focused on keeping a civilian alive to spend any energy on what had happened to her on a range. But the name of a situation that wasn't finished yet. It had consequences still unresolved. What's the status? Avery asked. Barrett's review is proceeding. External instructors from Warcom arrive Thursday. The 9 candidate removal decisions will be examined individually. Sloane's voice was careful. Not protective of Maddox, not punitive either, the careful voice of someone managing a complex institutional situations, with multiple valid concerns in tension. He's been given the opportunity to present his perspective. She paused.
She stopped.
He also what? Avery said. Sloane opened her desk drawer and removed a single sheet of paper and placed it on the desk facing Avery. Avery looked at it. It was a handwritten note. Not long, 8 lines. Maybe 9. The handwriting was precise and controlled, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was taught as a discipline. She recognized the hand from the range documentation she'd seen Maddox produce during the formal inquiry. She read it. It said, I have been conducting this review of my own program record for the past 36 hours. I have identified 11 removal decisions in the past 22 months that I am no longer confident were made on legitimate performance grounds. I am prepared to acknowledge this in the formal review process. I am also prepared to acknowledge that my instructional methodology, in certain respects, caused demonstrable harm to candidates that technical outcome data does not capture. I am requesting the opportunity to provide this acknowledgement on the record. I am not requesting reinstatement. I am requesting the chance to say what needs to be said, for the benefit of the record and of the people the record concerns. Avery read it twice. She set it back on the desk. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. She thought about Maddox at the range entrance that morning, walking out, stopping, asking how many missions in a voice that had finally lost its armor. She thought about what it cost a man like Maddox to write 8 lines like these, not as a legal strategy. She could tell from the language that this wasn't a legal strategy. It was too unhedged for that, too plain. It was the writing of someone who had sat with something long enough to understand it, and had then made a decision about what the understanding required of them. He doesn't have to do this, Avery said. No, Sloane agreed. It won't reverse what happened to those candidates. No. But it will create the record that allows some of them to have their removals re-examined. And it gives the review process something to work with that makes the outcome cleaner, institutionally. Avery was quiet. What do you think? Sloane asked. I think, Avery paused. I think some people understand things too late and some people never understand them at all. And the first category still deserves the chance to do something with what they've understood. And if the doing can't fix the original cost, she looked at Sloane. Let him give his statement. Sloane nodded. She picked up the note and placed it back in the drawer. One more thing, she said. And this one isn't a condition or a policy discussion. She looked at Avery directly. How are you, actually? Avery had been asked this question twice in the past 6 hours, and had given 2 versions of an honest but incomplete answer. She considered the complete answer. I think I've been grieving wrong for 2 years, she said. Incorrectly, exactly. Logan's death was real, and the grief was real, and the need to step back from operational work was real. But I've been spending the grief on myself on the question of whether I deserved to survive, whether walking away was the right decision, whether the things I was capable of were things I had the right to still be capable of. She paused. That's not what the grief should have been for. The grief should have been for him, for who he was, what he built, what he tried to teach. She was quiet for a moment. Started doing that this morning, on the water, and it felt different. Sloane looked at her for a long time. Good, she said. Her voice was quiet. That's good. Dave Barrett made a sound that was not quite a word. He looked at him. His face was arranged in the expression he wore when something had been correctly named, and he wanted to acknowledge it without making more of it than it needed to be. Go get some rest, Sloane said. You start officially on Monday. The next 3 weeks will be curriculum review and program assessment before we bring in a new candidate cohort. She paused. That gives you time. Avery stood. She picked up the rifle case. At the door she stopped. The candidate cohort after the curriculum restructure, she said. I want Natalie Cruz assigned as a junior instructor for 1 evolution per cycle. Doesn't know it yet, But she's going to need somewhere to put what she's learned. And teaching is the best way to own what you know. Sloane made a note. Avery walked out. She found Natalie Cruz in the mess hall at noon. The mess hall at noon was full and loud in the institutional way of a place that serves 400 people in a 90-minute window. The particular noise of a working military base population at the one point in the day where the professional structure relaxes enough for actual human sound. Natalie was at a corner table eating alone, her tray in front of her and a notebook open beside it, and she looked up when Avery sat down across from her with the wariness of someone who has had enough unexpected conversations in the past 3 days to be cautious about new ones. "I heard something happen," Natalie said. "Off base. This morning." "You heard correctly. Are you all right?" The question arrived with the directness of someone who asks it because they actually want to know rather than as a conversational formality. Avery registered the genuineness of it. "Yes," she said. "With that for a second, Cruz, because I want you to hear what I'm about to tell you." Natalie put down her fork. "The Advanced Sniper program is under new leadership effective Monday," Avery said. "I'm taking it. Barrett is co-leading." She paused. "The curriculum is going to change. Not immediately, there are authorization processes and that takes time. But the direction is changing and the methodology is changing. And the culture of this program is changing. And that change starts on Monday even if the paperwork takes months to catch up." Natalie was very still. "You're going to be asked," Emma continued, "in the 3rd week of the new cohort's training cycle, to run one evolution as a junior instructor, not a shooting evolution. Judgment exercise. I'll brief you on the specifics when the time comes." She looked at Natalie directly. "You're going to be nervous about it. You're going to feel like you haven't been here long enough to be on the instructing side. I'm going to tell you now, so you have time to build up your resistance to that feeling. You have been here exactly long enough. What you learned this week, not the marksmanship. The other thing, the harder thing, that is exactly what the people in that evolution need to receive from someone who just learned it. Not from someone who learned it 20 years ago. From someone who learned it this week." Natalie looked at her. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you know what it costs to be stood behind and told you're going to fail," Avery said. "And that means you know something about those candidates that I can't teach them from a classroom and Barrett can't tell them from 30 years of experience. You know it from the inside." She paused. "That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing." Natalie was quiet for a long moment. "I qualify first," she said. "I still have to finish the course." "You finish the course. You qualify, then you come back."
Avery stood up. "Don't rush the qualification."
"Do it right." She picked up her tray, Bennett. Natalie's voice stopped her. Avery turned. "I heard what you said on the range," Natalie said. "This morning. Before whatever happened off base. What you said to Maddox, respect." She paused. "I've been thinking about it, and I think it's the most important thing anyone has said in this program in a long time." Her voice was steady. "I'm going to remember it." "Good," she said. "Remember it and then figure out how to say it better. Because the version I said was Logan's version. Yours will be better for the people who need to hear it from you." She walked out of the mess hall. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that do not announce themselves as significant while they are happening. They presented as ordinary meetings, documentation, curriculum review. The slow, unglamorous work of institutional change moving through its required channels at the pace that institutional change moves, which was slower than impatience wanted and faster than despair expected. Avery had expected the pace. She had been briefed on the pace by people who had tried to change things inside bureaucratic structures before. She had adjusted her expectations accordingly and found that adjusted expectations were considerably more useful than frustrated ones. Barrett was exactly what she had asked for, and occasionally more difficult than she had prepared for, which was also what she had asked for. He pushed back on her curriculum proposals with the specific, informed pushback of someone who understood both the theory and the practical constraints, and she pushed back on his institutional concerns with the specific, operational pushback of someone who had learned what the gap between training and reality cost people in the field. The pushback produced better proposals than either of them would have built alone. That was the design. The co-signature policy for candidate removals went into effect in the 2nd week. It was an interim measure under Sloane's detachment authority, clean and straightforward, and it changed the daily functioning of the program in ways that were immediately visible to anyone paying attention. Candidates who had been managing their behavior under the assumption that any single bad day could end their careers felt the shift. The particular tension that comes from unchecked arbitrary authority, the tension that Maddox had cultivated because he believed it produced better shooters and that had instead produced broken confidence and suppressed ability in people who had. Fundamental capacity for the work began to ease. It didn't ease overnight. Institutional cultures don't ease overnight. But it eased. The formal review concluded in the 4th week. The external instructors from Warcom presented their findings to Sloan. 11 candidate removals were flagged for re-examination. 7 of those candidates were still within the eligibility window to request reinstatement to the program. 4 had already moved to other assignments that took them past that window. For the 4, the review generated formal corrections to their service records, corrections that documented that their removals had been assessed as insufficiently justified, which was not nothing and was also not everything. And Avery understood that the gap between those two things was one of the costs that documentation could acknowledge but never fully resolve. For the 7 who could request reinstatement, 3 did. Maddox gave his statement to the review panel on the 3rd day of the formal process. Avery was not in the room for it. She was running a curriculum development session with Barrett and had no official role in the review. But Donovan, who had been retained as a program instructor pending the review outcome, told her afterward what had happened. And Donovan's account was specific enough that she could construct the room from it. He had been thorough, he had been honest in ways that his professional training hadn't required and that his professional instincts had probably pushed against. He had named the specific decisions he had made from frustration rather than assessment, and the specific moments when his method had crossed from demanding into harmful, and the specific failure of character that had allowed him to mistake humiliation for instruction for as long as he had. He had not asked for reinstatement. He had asked at the end for the record to reflect one thing, that the program had been built on genuine marksmanship expertise, and that the expertise was real, and that the expertise was now in better hands than his, and that he acknowledged that distinction without reservation. When Donovan told her that, Avery was quiet for a long time. Then she said good, and she meant it the way she meant the word every time she used it, completely, without qualification, as a full statement rather than a placeholder for something longer. The new candidate cohort arrived on a Monday morning 6 weeks after the morning on the range where everything had changed. Avery stood at the front of the briefing room and looked at them. 14 people. Different ranks, different backgrounds, different reasons for being there. All of them wearing the particular expression of people who have arrived at a program with a reputation and are not yet certain what the reputation will cost them. Recognized the expression. She had worn it herself. Once. In a different room. In a different season. With Logan Pierce standing at the front of the room looking at her and the other candidates with the patient, direct attention of someone who saw them not as problems to be solved, but as people to be understood. She had tried to write down what he'd said in his first session. She hadn't been able to capture it on paper. It lived somewhere below the level of transcription in the body, in the accumulation of choices made and not made over years of difficult work. She stood at the front of the room. Barrett was at the rear, leaning against the back wall with his hands in his pockets, watching with the quiet attention he brought to things he considered important. She looked at the 14 people in front of her. A WAF rifle on the table beside her. She did not pick it up. She let it sit there present, visible. The thing they all knew they were here for, and she looked at the candidates and let the silence run for a moment, long enough to settle, not long enough to become uncomfortable. Then she said, "I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think about it before you answer it. You don't have to answer it out loud, but I want you to actually think about it." The room was very quiet. "Who are you?" she said, "when the person standing in front of you has nothing you want and no power over you?" Nobody spoke. She let the question exist in the room. "That question," she said, "is the foundation of this program. Everything else, the marksmanship, the qualification progressions, the technical training, all of it, is built on what your answer to that question is. Because the people you're going to protect with this capability won't always be people who can thank you for it. Most of them will never know your name. Most of them will never know you were there. And when you're in the position that matters, the one where everything is real and the decision is yours and the consequences are permanent, the thing that determines what you do is not your fundamentals." She paused. "It's who you are when you think nobody's watching." She looked at the faces in front of her. Some of them were writing. Some of them were looking at her with the concentrated attention of people hearing something they hadn't expected to hear on the first day of a technical program. A few of them looked uncertain, the way people look when a frame they've brought with them has just been replaced by a different frame and they're still orienting. Good. Uncertain was workable. Uncertain was the beginning of thinking. Certain was the beginning of stopping. Figure that out, she said. And then I'll teach you how to shoot. She picked up the rifle from the table. She turned it over in her hands, felt the familiar weight of it, the balance of it, the particular physical fact that had been part of her life, since before most of the people in this room had finished growing, and that she had spent 2 years trying to put away, and that she understood now she had never had the right to put away. Not because the work required her, because she was the work. The work was in her not as burden, not as weapon, but as the accumulated substance of everything she had been taught by someone who believed that precision was an act of care. Logan Pierce had tried to make her understand that. She understood it now. She set the rifle back on the table. We're going to start, she said, with a scenario. No rifles today. No range time today. Today I'm going to put you in a situation and ask you to make a decision. And then I'm going to ask you to explain your decision to the person sitting next to you. And then we're going to talk about what your decisions tell you about who you are and what this program is going to need from you over the next months. She looked at the room. If you came here expecting this to open with marksmanship drills, I understand the adjustment that requires. Give me 1 week. If at the end of 1 week you don't understand why we started here, come find me and tell me and I'll explain it to you personally. She paused. And if you come to me after 1 week and you still don't think it matters, she said, then we'll have a different conversation about whether this program is the right place for you. The room absorbed that. Avery looked at Barrett. He was looking at her with the expression he wore when something had been done correctly, the understated, genuine satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for the right thing to happen and is not going to make too much of it now that it has. She looked at the 14 candidates. She thought about Logan Pierce on a training range in Nevada, crouched beside her, explaining the difference between a shooter and a sniper in a voice that was easy and direct and impossible to forget. She thought about a research vessel off the Virginia coast, and a young woman with her face turned to the wind and 47 seconds of waiting, and the shot she'd chosen not to take. She thought about Maddox on the range asking how many, and the word enough and what it contained. She thought about this room, and these 14 people, and the months of work ahead, and what it was going to build. She thought about everything that had led here, the scope mount she'd noticed from 20 feet away, the rifle placed in her hands to humiliate her, the 3 shots that had started, something she couldn't have predicted and would not have chosen, and that had been, in the end, the right thing to have started. She thought about Cole Maddox and his smirk and the 2 words he had said and what he had believed those words would accomplish. She thought about what they had actually accomplished. And then she stopped thinking and started teaching. Weeks became months. The authorization for the curriculum restructure came through in the 7th week, which was faster than anyone had predicted and which Sloan attributed to the detail of the case they'd built and the specific involvement of Warcom officers who had operational experience with the gap between training outcomes and field performance, and had been looking for a program that was trying to close it. Natalie Cruz qualified in her 8th week and came back to the program as a junior instructor in the 10th. She ran her first judgment scenario evolution on a Tuesday morning and was visibly nervous beforehand in the way that people are nervous when something matters to them, and ran it cleanly in the way that people run things when they have done the preparation that nervousness requires. The candidates in her evolution rated it the highest of any session that week. She came to Avery's office afterward and stood in the doorway. Terrified, she said. I know, Avery said. You were good. How can you be both? That's the whole skill, Avery said. That's all of it. Right there, Natalie thought about that. She nodded. She left. Barrett retired on a Thursday in the 12th week. It was a small ceremony because he had specifically requested a few people from his chain of command, the instructional staff of the program he'd co-built, and Avery standing beside Sloan as he received the formal acknowledgement of 30 years of service and the particular quiet dignity that attaches to a career built on principle rather than performance. He came to find her afterward, away from the reception, standing outside in the cold air in the way she stood outside, sometimes not for the cold exactly, just for the open space and the particular quality of air that wasn't inside anything. What do you do now? She asked. My daughter is in Portland, he said. She has 2 kids I don't know well enough yet. I'm going to fix that. He looked at her. You're all right here? Yes. The program's going to be all right? It's going to be better than all right, she said. You built the structure. The structure holds, he nodded. Logan would have liked this, he said. What you've built, you keep saying that. It keeps being true. She looked at him. At the career in his face, 30 years of it. compressed into the particular weathered steadiness of someone who had done difficult things for long enough that the difficulty had become simply the texture of life rather than the exception to it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Go teach your class," he said. He walked to his car. She watched him go. On a morning 6 months after the morning on the range where everything began, Avery stood at the front of a new class. Different candidates. Third cohort under the new curriculum. 14 more people who had arrived with expectations that the first week had rearranged, who were now midway through a program that was building something in them that no marksmanship score would fully capture, but that would show up, eventually, in the field in the moments where it mattered. She placed a rifle on the table. She asked the question she always asked. Behind her, through the window that faced the range, could see the steel target at the far end, the same target that Maddox had pointed toward on a rain-soaked Monday morning and said, "This is where pretending ends." The same steel she had struck twice in 3 seconds with a borrowed rifle and no preparation and the weight of 2 years of unprocessed grief pressing against the calculation. The same target. Different morning. She looked at the candidates in front of her. She thought about everything that had led to this room. She didn't linger on it. She let it move through her the way she let most things move through her now present. Acknowledged, not suppressed and not indulged. Logan had taught her that feelings were information, not weather. You read them and you used what they told you and then you got back to the work. Got back to the work. "Last question before we start," she said to the room. "And this one I want you to answer out loud. Don't think about it too long." She looked at them steadily. "What does it mean to protect someone you'll never meet?" Silence for a moment. Then from the third row, a candidate she'd been watching for 2 weeks, quiet and precise in the way of people who are building towards something, a voice. "It means you do the right thing even when there's no one to confirm that you did it." Avery looked at her. She thought about Logan Pierce on a rain-soaked overwatch position in the Eastern Mediterranean, doing the right thing, with nobody to confirm it, for people he would never meet, right up until the moment the radio went silent. She thought about what it meant to carry someone forward. Thought about who she had been and who she was and what the distance between those two things had cost and what it had built and what it was still building. And she said, her voice was steady and quiet and complete. "It's exactly what it means." Cole Maddox had been right. The woman who carried ammunition boxes and kept her head down and spent 2 years making herself invisible, she was finished. The sniper who had spent 22 months running from her own precision, she was finished. And the teacher who stood at the front of this room, with Logan Pierce's lessons in her hands, and the next generation of operators in front of her, and the full, honest weight of everything she had been through, settled finally into something she could carry. Without flinching, she had just begun.